I walked into the corporate headquarters expecting to see my son in a corner office. Instead, I found him on his knees in the men's room scrubbing a toilet with a toothbrush, while his father-in-law kicked the bucket of dirty water onto his cheap suit. My daughter-in-law stood at the door checking her lipstick and said, "He is finally useful for something." They thought I was just a poor old man in a flannel shirt. They didn't know I own the bank that holds their $12 million mortgage. Before I destroy their entire world, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a lesson to ungrateful people. My name is Conrad Blackwood, and for 40 years, people in this town have known me as the guy who drives a rusted 1985 Ford pickup truck. They see the flannel shirts I buy in 3-packs at the discount store. They see the callus on my hands and the grease under my fingernails. They assume I live check to check, surviving on a pension and memories. I never correct them. Silence is the most expensive luxury I own. What they do not know is that my construction firm built half the skyline of this city before I sold it for 9 figures a decade ago. I kept the truck because it reminds me of where I came from. I kept the flannel because it is comfortable. And I kept my money in a blind trust because I wanted my son Toby to build his own character without the crutch of my wealth. That Tuesday morning, the engine of my old Ford rattled as I pulled up to the gleaming glass tower of Pendergast Logistics. It was a monument to modern ego, 20 stories of steel and arrogance rising out of the pavement. I parked my truck between a Porsche and a Mercedes, ignoring the dirty looks from the valet parking attendants. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the metal lunchbox I had packed that morning. Inside was meatloaf and mashed potatoes, Toby's favorite since he was 5 years old. Today was his first day. My daughter-in-law Vanessa had bragged at Sunday dinner that her father Richard Pendergast had finally appointed Toby as the director of sales. It was a big title, a big step. I wanted to surprise him. I wanted to see him sitting behind a mahogany desk, finally getting the respect he deserved after 3 years of marriage to that woman. I walked through the revolving doors, my work boots squeaking against the polished Italian marble floors. The lobby smelled of expensive perfume and money, but underneath I could smell the rot. I have been in business long enough to know when a company is overcompensating. The receptionist, a young woman who looked like she cost more per hour than the furniture, didn't even look up from her phone. I cleared my throat. "I am here to see Toby Blackwood," I said, my voice rough from years of shouting over jackhammers. She glanced at my faded jeans and the oil stain on my sleeve. "Deliveries are in the back." "Old man," she said, waving a manicured hand toward the service entrance. "I am not a delivery driver," I said, keeping my temper in check. "I am his father." She laughed, a short, sharp sound like breaking glass. "Mr. Blackwood does not see visitors, especially not visitors who look like they wandered in from a construction site. Please leave before I call security." I didn't argue. I learned a long time ago that you do not fight the gatekeeper. You walk around the gate. I walked out the front door, waited 30 seconds, and slipped in through the side entrance where the smokers congregated. I knew the layout of this building. I should. I poured the concrete for the foundation 20 years ago. I took the service elevator up to the executive floor, the lunchbox clutching tight in my hand. The hallways were silent, lined with abstract art that cost more than my first house. I looked for a door with Toby's name on it. I expected to see Director of Sales etched in gold. I walked past office after office. Nothing. Then I heard it. A voice shouting. It was coming from the end of the hall near the restrooms. It was a voice I recognized. Richard Pendergast. I moved closer, the metal lunchbox heavy in my hand. The door to the men's room was propped open with a trash can. The smell hit me first. Not the smell of success, but the stinging chemical burn of industrial bleach mixed with the vile odor of sewage. I stepped into the doorway and froze. The scene before me made the blood in my veins turn to ice. My son Toby, my boy who had graduated with honors, who had an MBA, was not sitting at a desk. He was on his knees on the cold tile floor. He was wearing a suit that I knew he had bought on credit, but the jacket was thrown in the corner and his sleeves were rolled up. In his hand was not a pen, but a small red toothbrush. He was scrubbing the rim of a toilet bowl, his face inches from the porcelain. Richard Pendergast stood over him, looking like a king in a three-piece suit that strained against his gut. He was holding a coffee cup in one hand and pointing with the other. "You missed a spot," he sneered. "Scrub it again. Use your fingernails if you have to. That is all you are good for, boy. Cleaning up other people's mess. Just like your father." I gripped the doorframe. My knuckles turned white. I wanted to rush in and break Richard's jaw, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of it. And then I saw her. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law. She was leaning against the sinks, checking her reflection in the mirror. She wasn't horrified. She wasn't defending her husband. She was bored. Richard kicked the yellow bucket next to Toby. Dirty gray water sloshed out, soaking Toby's pants and ruining his shoes. "Oops," Richard laughed. "Look at that. Now you have to clean the floor again." Toby flinched, but didn't look up. "I am sorry, Mr. Pendergast," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I will clean it up. Please just don't fire me." Vanessa sighed, adjusting a strand of hair. "Hurry up, Toby," she said, her voice dripping with annoyance. "Daddy has a VIP client coming in 20 minutes. Do not let the smell of bleach drift into the hallway. It is embarrassing enough that you are sweating like a pig." That was the moment the dam broke. I stepped fully into the room. The metal lunchbox clattered onto the tiled floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Toby jerked his head up. His eyes were red-rimmed with dark circles filled with a humiliation so deep it looked like physical pain. "Dad," he choked out. Richard spun around. His face went from malicious glee to disgust in a nanosecond. "Well, well," he said, his voice oily. "If it isn't the janitor's father. Did you come to help him? We do not pay overtime, Conrad." I walked past Richard, ignoring him completely. I went to my son. I grabbed the toothbrush from his hand and threw it into the trash. "Stand up, Toby," I said. My voice was low, dangerous. Toby looked at me, then at Richard, then at Vanessa. He was shaking. "Dad, please," he whispered. "I need this job." Vanessa said if I don't make it through the probation period, we lose the apartment. "She is pregnant, Dad." "I have to do this." "Pregnant." The word hung in the air. Vanessa smirked, placing a hand on her flat stomach. "That is right, Conrad. Your grandson needs a father who provides, not a loser who quits. He starts at the bottom. That is the Pendergast way. If he wants to be a director, he proves he can shovel shit first." I looked at Vanessa. I saw the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. I saw the designer shoes that cost $2,000. I saw the cruelty in her eyes that had nothing to do with teaching a lesson and everything to do with sadistic control. "This is not a job," I said to her. "This is slavery. You told us he was hired as a director." Vanessa laughed. "Titles are earned, Conrad. Besides, he is not qualified for anything else. Look at him. He is soft. He is weak. He takes after you." Richard stepped forward, invading my personal space. He smelled of expensive scotch and decay. "Get out of my building, Conrad," he spat. "You are trespassing, and take your lunchbox with you. We do not allow outside food. It violates health codes." He snapped his fingers, and two security guards who had been waiting in the hall stepped in. They were big men looking for an excuse to use force. "Escort this old man out," Richard ordered. "He is making the bathroom dirty." One of the guards grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, painful. I didn't resist. I didn't fight back. I looked at Toby one last time. His head was bowed, tears dripping onto the wet floor he had just scrubbed. He looked broken, defeated. A man stripped of his dignity by the people who claimed to love him. I looked at Richard. I looked at the smug satisfaction on his face. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Richard," I said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. "Get him out," Richard yelled. The guards dragged me backward. As they pulled me through the door, one of them kicked the lunchbox I had dropped. The lid popped open. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes spilled across the polished hallway floor, a pathetic mess of home-cooked love wasted on a floor of marble and greed. Richard laughed. "Look at that," he shouted. "Like father, like son. Now Toby has to clean the hallway too." They threw me out the back exit into the alley where the dumpsters were kept. I stumbled but didn't fall. I straightened my flannel shirt. I dusted off my jeans. I walked around the building to where my truck was parked. The sun was shining, but I felt cold. A deep freezing cold that settled in the marrow of my bones. I climbed into the cab of the Ford. The vinyl seat was hot from the sun. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles popped. I didn't turn on the ignition. Instead, I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a phone. Not my regular phone. This was an old, secure flip phone I kept for emergencies. I hadn't used it in 5 years. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. "Rough alert. Kowalski here." Kowalski was my former head of legal, a man who used to hunt white-collar criminals for the Justice Department before I hired him to protect my empire. He was semi-retired now, fishing in Florida, but he always picked up for me. "I need you to open the vault, Kowalski," I said. The anger was gone from my voice, replaced by a flat, deadly calm. "I am activating option 4. There was a pause on the line. "Option 4. Kowalski asked, his tone shifting from casual to sharp. "Conrad, that is the Scorched Earth Protocol. That is for hostile takeovers and corporate warfare. Are you sure?" I looked up at the shimmering glass tower of Pendergast Logistics. I thought of Toby on his knees. I thought of the toothbrush. I thought of the lie about the pregnancy. I was absolutely sure. "I want you to buy the debt," I said. "All of it. Pendergast Logistics. I want their corporate loans, their lines of credit, and Richard's personal mortgage. I want to own every cent that man owes to every bank in this country. And I want it done by close of business today." Kowalski whistled low. "Richard Pendergast, the logistics guy. Market rumors say he is leveraged to the hilt. He is swimming in red ink. If we buy his debt, we are buying a sinking ship. It will cost you millions, Conrad. It is a bad investment." "I am not investing in his company, Kowalski," I said, starting the engine of my truck. The old V8 roared to life, a sound of raw power. "I am investing in his destruction. Find out everything. I want to know who he owes, how much he owes, and who he is sleeping with. I want a forensic audit of his life. Do it." I hung up the phone and pulled out into traffic. I didn't go home. I drove to a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, ordered a black coffee, and waited. The sun went down. The city lights came on. I sat there watching the clock, waiting for the darkness to settle. I knew Toby would be getting off work soon. I knew he would go back to that luxury apartment I had paid the $50,000 deposit for. I knew Vanessa would be waiting for him, probably complaining that his hands smelled like bleach. I paid for my coffee and drove to their apartment building. It was a high-end complex with a doorman and a fountain out front. I parked down the street in the shadows. I watched as Toby walked into the lobby, his shoulders slumped, his spirit crushed. 10 minutes later, I saw the lights go on in their third-floor unit. I could see shadows moving against the sheer curtains. I saw Vanessa pacing, gesturing, yelling. I saw Toby standing there taking it. I didn't go up. Not yet. I needed to let the poison work a little longer. I needed Toby to reach his breaking point. But more than that, I needed information. My phone buzzed. It was Kowalski. I opened the email attachment on my small screen. It was a preliminary credit report on Richard Pendergast. The numbers were staggering. $12 million in corporate debt. $3 million in personal loans. He was months behind on payments. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, and he was using my son as the fall guy. I read further. There were transfers to offshore accounts, gambling debts in Vegas, and payments to a woman who was definitely not his wife. But the most interesting part was the employee contracts. Kowalski had managed to hack into their HR server. I found Toby's contract. It wasn't a standard employment agreement. It was a nightmare. It listed him as an independent contractor with full liability for departmental losses. They weren't just humiliating him. They were setting him up. If the company went under, Toby would be the one holding the bag for millions in losses. I closed the phone. My hands were steady. The rage was now a cold, hard knot in my chest. They wanted to play games. Fine. I was about to change the rules. I waited until the lights in the apartment went out. Then I drove home to my small, modest house on the edge of town. I walked into my study, a room I kept locked. I moved the old bookshelf and opened the wall safe. Inside were stacks of documents, deeds, and bearer bonds, the accumulation of a lifetime of hard work and smart risks. I took out a fresh file folder. I wrote Pendergast on the tab. Then I sat down at my desk and began to write. I drafted a plan. Phase 1, financial strangulation. Phase 2, social exposure. Phase 3, the final confrontation. I worked through the night. I didn't sleep. I didn't need to. The image of my son scrubbing that toilet was fuel enough to keep me awake for a century. By the time the sun rose, I had a plan. It was brutal. It was ruthless. And it was going to cost me a fortune. But as I looked at the framed photo of Toby on my desk, a picture of him graduating college with a smile that could light up a room, I knew it was worth every penny. I showered, shaved, and put on my best flannel shirt. It was time to go to work. I drove back to the city, but this time I didn't go to Pendergast Logistics. I went to the bank. My bank. The one where I was the largest private shareholder. I walked into the branch manager's office without an appointment. He looked up, surprised, then terrified. "Mr. Blackwood," he stammered. "We didn't expect you." I sat down. "I want to call in a favor, Jenkins," I said. "You hold the commercial paper on Pendergast Logistics." Jenkins nodded, sweating. "Yes, sir. It is a significant portion of our portfolio." "Sell it to me," I said. Jenkins blinked. "Sir, it is a distressed asset. It is high risk. Sell it to me," I repeated, "at face value, today." "And Jenkins, I want the right to immediate foreclosure." I walked out of the bank an hour later, the owner of Richard Pendergast's financial soul. I had the leverage. Now I just needed the opportunity to use it, and I knew exactly how to get it. I picked up my phone and called Kowalski again. "Phase 1 is complete," I said. "Now for Phase 2. Get me a meeting with Richard. Tell him you represent a private equity firm looking to invest $5 million. Tell him you want to save his company. He will be desperate enough to take the bait." Kowalski laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "And what is the catch, Conrad?" "The catch," I said, watching the morning traffic crawl by, "is that the investor wants to inspect the facilities personally. Specifically the bathrooms. I want to see if he keeps them clean." I hung up and started the truck. The game was on. Richard Pendergast thought he was the king of the castle. He thought he could kick a Blackwood and get away with it. He was about to find out that when you kick a wolf, you better make sure you kill it. Because if you don't, the wolf comes back, and he brings the whole pack. I navigated the labyrinth of the first floor, the air conditioning humming a low, artificial note that chilled the sweat on my neck. I kept my head down, clutching the handle of the metal lunchbox like it was a shield. I scanned the frosted glass doors, looking for a brass plaque with my son's name. Tobias Blackwood, Director of Sales. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. I would knock, he would look up from a stack of important contracts, surprised but happy, and we would eat meatloaf together while he told me about his team. But the names on the doors were strangers. Vice President of Logistics, Head of Operations, Senior Analyst, no Toby. I reached the end of the corridor, where the executive suites gave way to the service areas. The plush carpet turned to hard gray linoleum. The silence here was different. It wasn't the hush of productivity. It was the heavy silence of secrets. Then I heard it. A voice. It was booming, echoing off tiled walls, unmistakable in its arrogance. Richard Pendergast. I froze. Why would the CEO be shouting in the service hallway? I moved closer to the door marked, "Men, the only door in this wing that wasn't locked." The smell hit me before I even touched the handle. It wasn't the subtle scent of air freshener. It was a chemical assault. Raw bleach, ammonia. The kind of industrial cleaner that burns the inside of your nose and makes your eyes water. It smelled like a hospital morgue or a prison shower. My stomach turned. I pushed the door open, the hinges squeaking slightly, but the sound was drowned out by Richard's voice. "Scrub it harder," he barked. "I paid for that suit you are wearing, so you better not be afraid to get it dirty." I stepped inside, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights. The scene before me didn't make sense. It was like looking at a distorted image in a funhouse mirror. Richard was standing by the sinks, his arms crossed, looking down with a sneer that twisted his face into something ugly. And there on the floor was my son. Toby. My boy. He was on his knees. He wasn't wearing the protective gloves I used to make him wear when he helped me at construction sites during the summers. His hands were bare red and raw from the chemicals. He was hunched over the furthest toilet, his fine wool trousers soaking up the filthy water on the floor. In his hand he held a toothbrush, a tiny red plastic toothbrush. He was scrubbing the rim of the porcelain bowl with a frantic, desperate rhythm, his head bowed so low his chin almost touched his chest. The air was thick with the fumes, but underneath it I could smell the fear. It radiated off him. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, stripped of his dignity, stripped of his education, reduced to manual labor that was clearly designed to break him, not to clean a bathroom. He wasn't doing a job. He was serving a sentence. I stood there, the lunchbox feeling suddenly incredibly heavy, my breath caught in a throat that felt like it was closing up. This wasn't a mentorship. This was torture. Richard shifted his weight, the leather of his expensive shoes creaking against the tile, a sound that seemed too loud in the confined space. He looked down at Toby, not with the disappointment of a boss, but with the sneer of a predator toying with a wounded animal. Without a word of warning, he pulled his leg back and drove the toe of his polished loafer hard into the side of the yellow mop bucket. The plastic cracked with a sharp snap, and a wave of gray, chemically tainted water surged over the rim. It splashed across the front of Toby's suit, soaking into the cheap fabric of his white shirt and turning his blue tie a dark, sodden black. Toby gasped, the cold water shocking him, but he did not stand up. He did not wipe it off. He simply froze his knuckles white around the handle of that ridiculous toothbrush, water dripping from his chin onto the floor he had just scrubbed. "Oops," Richard said, his voice dripping with a mock apology that was far crueler than any insult. "I guess you are just clumsy by nature. Or maybe it is genetic." He leaned forward, bracing his hands on his knees, so his face was level with my son's. "Scrub it again, Toby, and this time put some muscle into it. You need to scrub deep. You need to scrub away that low-class stench you brought into my family. You might be wearing a suit, but we both know you are just blue-collar trash playing dress-up." I felt a growl rising in my throat, a primal noise of rage, but before I could step forward, a movement by the sinks caught my eye. It was Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, the woman who had eaten at my table, who had smiled at me at Christmas, who had vowed to love and honor my son. She was leaning against the marble countertop, completely unbothered by the cruelty unfolding 3 feet away from her. She wasn't wringing her hands in distress. She wasn't pleading with her father to stop. She was calmly opening her compact mirror, checking her teeth for lipstick smudges. She snapped the compact shut with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. "Pick up the pace, honey," she said, her tone bored, as if she were asking him to take out the trash rather than watching him being dehumanized. "Daddy has the VIP investors arriving in the lobby in 15 minutes. If this bathroom isn't sparkling, you are going to ruin the whole presentation." Toby looked up at her then, a desperate, silent plea in his eyes. He looked like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. "Vanessa, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My knees are bleeding." She didn't even look down at him. She smoothed the skirt of her designer dress, checking for any stray splashes of water that might have dared to touch her. "Don't be dramatic, Toby," she sighed, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. "Bleeding builds character. Besides, you heard Daddy. This is the only way you are going to learn how the real world works. You want the paycheck? You want the lifestyle? Then stop whining and start scrubbing. The smell in here is awful, and honestly, you are making me nauseous." She turned to Richard, her face brightening into a dazzling fake smile. "Daddy makes sure he uses the air freshener when he is done. We can't have the partners thinking we run a zoo." Richard chuckled, reaching out to pat her cheek affectionately. "Don't worry, princess. I will make sure he learns his place." He looked back down at Toby, his expression hardening instantly into stone. "You heard her. You have 10 minutes to undo the mess you just made. If I see one spot, just one, you are fired. And you know what happens to the apartment if you lose this job." Toby lowered his head, defeated, and dipped the toothbrush back into the remaining sludge at the bottom of the broken bucket. The sound of bristles scratching against porcelain filled the room again, a rhythm of absolute submission. I had seen enough. The heat in my chest was no longer anger. It was a cold, calculating resolve. They had broken my boy. Now I was going to break their world. The sound of that cheap plastic toothbrush scraping against the ceramic was the sound of my patience snapping like a dry twig. I crossed the wet, slippery tiles in 2 long strides, my heavy work boots splashing through the puddle of gray water Richard had kicked over. I didn't say a word. I didn't ask for permission. I reached down my hand, moving with the speed of a man who has caught falling hammers on construction sites, and I snatched that red toothbrush right out of Toby's trembling hand. He gasped, flinching, as if I were about to strike him, which broke my heart more than seeing him on his knees. I looked at the brush dripping with filth and chemicals, a symbol of his degradation, and I hurled it across the room. It hit the far wall with a wet smack and clattered into the open trash can. "That is enough," I growled, my voice vibrating off the tiled walls. "Get up, Toby. You are done here." Richard didn't step back. He didn't look afraid. He looked amused, like a man watching a dog try to perform a card trick. He slowly turned his head toward me, looking me up and down with a sneer that curled his upper lip. He took in my faded flannel shirt, the oil stains on my jeans, and the scuffed leather of my boots. He chuckled, a low, wet sound that made my skin crawl. "Well, look at this," Richard said, addressing the room as if he were holding court. "The hillbilly cavalry has arrived. Did you get lost on your way to the soup kitchen, Conrad? Or did you just come here to show your boy the family trade, I suppose? Scrubbing toilets is hereditary in your bloodline?" I ignored him, keeping my eyes on my son. Toby was still on his knees, staring at his empty hand as if he didn't know what to do without the brush. "Get up, son," I repeated, reaching out to grab his shoulder. "We are leaving." Richard stepped between us, blocking my hand. "You are not taking anyone anywhere, old man," he snapped, his voice suddenly losing its amusement and turning sharp. "You seem to be confused about how the corporate world works. You see, in this building, people do what I tell them to do. And right now, there is no son of yours in this room." He pointed a manicured finger at Toby, who was shrinking into himself, making himself as small as possible. Look at him, Conrad. Does that look like a Blackwood to you? That is just the head janitor I hired this morning. That is all he is. That is all he is capable of. He cleans my shit because that is the only value he brings to my company. If he walks out that door with you, he is not just quitting a job. He is quitting his family. He is quitting my daughter. I felt the rage rising a hot tide in my chest, but before I could shove Richard into the wall, a sound stopped me cold. It was a sob, a pathetic, broken whimper. I looked down. Toby hadn't stood up. He hadn't defended himself. He hadn't defended me. Instead, he was scrambling on his hands and knees, reaching toward the trash can where I had thrown the toothbrush. Tears were streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat and grime. "Dad, stop, please," Toby begged, his voice high and terrified. "You are making it worse. You don't understand." He looked up at Richard, not with anger, but with absolute, abject fear. "I am so sorry, Mr. Pendergast," he stammered, his hands shaking violently. "Please forgive him. He is old. He doesn't know I will finish it. I promise. I will stay late. I will clean the whole floor. Just please don't tell Vanessa. Don't fire me." He found the toothbrush in the trash. He pulled it out, and he put it back on the rim of the toilet. My hands fell to my sides. The strength didn't leave my body, but the hope did. I watched my son, the boy I had raised to be strong, to be honest, to be proud, apologizing to the man who was abusing him. He wasn't doing it out of respect. He was doing it because he was terrified. They had him. They had their claws so deep into his psyche that he couldn't see the exit, even when I opened the door for him. Richard smiled at me, a victorious, shark-like grin. "See," he said softly. "He knows where he belongs. Now get out of my sight, you old relic. You are muddying up my floor, and your son has a lot of work to do to fix your mess." I turned my back on Richard, because looking at him was making my hands itch with a violence I had not felt since the war. I focused my gaze on the one person who actually owed my son loyalty. Vanessa was still standing by the door, tapping her foot, impatiently checking the time on a watch that cost more than my truck. She looked at Toby scrubbing the floor with a mixture of boredom and mild disgust, as if he were a stain on her perfect morning. "Vanessa," I said, my voice low and trembling with the effort to keep it steady. "Sunday night, at my dinner table, you looked me in the eye and told me Toby was hired as the director of sales. You told me he had a corner office. You told me he was leading a team. Was that just a joke to you?" She finally looked at me. Her eyes were cold, devoid of any of the warmth she used to fake when she needed me to co-sign a lease. "Don't be so literal, Conrad," she scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Director janitor. What is the difference right now? He is part of the company. That is what matters." "There is a hell of a difference," I snapped. "One manages accounts. The other manages human waste. You lied to us. You lied to him." She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the tile, getting right in my face. She smelled of expensive vanilla perfume, a sweet scent masking a rotten core. "I didn't lie," she hissed. "I managed expectations. Look at him, Conrad. Really look at your son. He is soft. He is incompetent. He walked in here thinking his degree meant he was too good to sweat. Daddy is doing him a favor. This is the Pendergast method. You start at the bottom, the very bottom. You learn to eat dirt so you appreciate the steak later." I looked at Toby, who was keeping his head down, scrubbing the same spot over and over again, trying to make himself invisible. "This isn't training," I said to her. "This is humiliation. You are breaking him." "Good," she said, and the cruelty in her voice was absolute. "He needs to be broken. He needs to be rebuilt into a man who can actually provide for me." Right now, he is useless. He doesn't know how to close a deal. He doesn't know how to intimidate a rival. The only thing he is qualified to do is clean up shit, so that is what he is going to do until Daddy says otherwise. She checked her reflection in the mirror again, smoothing a stray hair. And honestly, Conrad, you are making this worse. You standing here in your dirty flannel smelling like old oil is embarrassing me. Daddy has investors coming. Real people with real money. We cannot have you cluttering up the service entrance looking like a beggar. She pointed a manicured finger at the door. Go home. Go back to your little porch and your little life. Leave the business to the adults. You are making Toby look like a daddy's boy, and frankly, he looks pathetic enough already. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that the girl I had welcomed into my family was a monster. She didn't love my son. She loved the idea of controlling him. I am leaving, I said, my voice ice cold. But remember this moment, Vanessa. Remember the day you called my son useless, because the wheel turns. It always turns. She laughed a dry, humorless sound. The wheel turns for people who own the car, Conrad. You are just roadkill. Now get out before I have security throw you out. I have a reputation to maintain. Richard looked down at the faint, muddy footprint my work boot had left on his pristine gray tile. He stared at it with exaggerated horror, as if I had just bled on his carpet. You are contaminating my building, he declared, his voice booming with theatrical outrage. Security, remove this biohazard immediately, before I soil the air any further. The two guards who had been hovering in the hallway like vultures stepped into the restroom. One was tall and thin, the other broad with a neck that disappeared into his shoulders. They didn't ask me to leave. They grabbed me. The big one clamped a hand onto my bicep, his fingers digging into the muscle with unnecessary force. The other grabbed the back of my flannel shirt, bunching the fabric tight against my neck. Easy, boys, I said, my voice steady though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I can walk. I know the way out. Drag him, Richard ordered, lighting a cigarette right there in the bathroom, defying his own building's smoke-free policy. I want him to feel the friction. Maybe it will scrub some of the dirt off him. Make sure everyone in the hallway sees what happens when trash tries to enter the executive suite. I looked at Toby. He had stopped scrubbing. He was watching me being manhandled, his face a mask of pure agony. He started to stand up, his mouth opening to protest, to say something, anything. But Vanessa cleared her throat. A sharp warning sound. It was like a command to a dog. Toby froze. He looked at her, then at me, and he sank back down to his knees. He chose his tormentor over his father. That betrayal broke me more than the guard's grip ever could. I didn't struggle. I didn't flail. I let them pull me backward out of the restroom. I locked eyes with Richard one last time. I didn't blink. I didn't shout. I spoke with the quiet certainty of a man who knows the structural integrity of a building before it collapses. Remember this day, Richard? I said, my voice cutting through the sound of the running water. Memorize the time. Memorize the feeling of power you have right now, because it is the last time you will ever feel it. You just evicted your only lifeline. Richard just laughed, blowing smoke in my direction. Get him out of here, he shouted, and throw that disgusting lunchbox after him. I don't want his charity food stinking up my drains. They dragged me down the service corridor, past the open doors, where junior analysts stared with wide eyes. They didn't see a millionaire being disrespected. They saw a crazy old man being taken out like trash. They opened the heavy steel service door leading to the alley and shoved. I stumbled out onto the concrete loading dock. My knees hit the pavement hard, the grit tearing through the fabric of my jeans. I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder where the guard had wrenched it. Behind me there was a metallic clatter. My lunchbox hit the ground. The latch broke. The Tupperware container inside cracked open. The meatloaf I had made at 5 in the morning, The mashed potatoes I had seasoned with extra butter just the way Toby liked them spilled out onto the dirty asphalt. It landed next to a puddle of oil and a cigarette butt. A meal made with love, now garbage for the rats. "Stay out, old man," the guard grunted. "Next time we call the cops." The steel door slammed shut with a heavy final boom. I was alone in the alley. The hum of the city surrounded me, indifferent to my shame. I looked at the ruined food. I looked at the grease stain on my knee. I felt the humiliation burning my face, hot and stinging. But as I pushed myself up, dusting off my hands, the heat turned cold. They thought they had thrown out garbage. They didn't know they had just thrown away their future. I climbed into the cab of my 1985 Ford, the vinyl seat hot against my back, but I was shivering. My hands, usually steady enough to thread a needle or wield a sledgehammer, were vibrating on the steering wheel. It wasn't fear. It was a rage so pure, so concentrated, it felt like I had swallowed a cup of molten lead. I looked out the dirty windshield at the brick wall of the alley. I could still see the image of my son on his knees. I could still hear the snap of Richard's shoe against the bucket. I could still smell the bleach. I reached under the passenger seat. There was a hidden compartment there welded by my own hands 20 years ago. I popped the latch and pulled out a small black hard case. Inside sat a phone that looked like a relic from the early 2000s. A simple matte black flip phone. No apps, no camera, no tracking. But the satellite encryption on this line cost more than Richard's entire fleet of delivery trucks. I flipped it open. The screen glowed a dull green. I didn't need a contact list. I punched in the number from memory. It rang once. "Kowalski," a voice answered. It sounded like gravel in a cement mixer. Kowalski didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was. He knew that if this specific line was ringing, the world was about to change. He was my fixer, my lawyer, and the only man who knew exactly how many skeletons were buried in the foundation of my empire. "I need you to open the vault," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. It was quiet. Too quiet. "We are going hunting." "Who is the target?" Kowalski asked, the faint click of a keyboard already audible in the background. "Richard Pendergast. Pendergast Logistics." The father-in-law, Kowalski, paused. "I thought we were playing the poor retired grandfather role. I thought you were trying to let the kid build his own character." "Character building is over," I replied, watching a rat scurry toward the spilled meatloaf on the asphalt. "They had him scrubbing toilets, Kowalski. They had my son on his knees in his own filth while they laughed." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Understood. "What is the play hostile takeover? Do you want me to crash their stock?" I said. "That is too impersonal. I want him to know it was me." "Activate debt, clause number 4. There was a silence on the line. A heavy, pregnant silence. Clause 4. "Conrad, that is the nuclear option. That is purchasing distressed debt at face value purely for leverage. You are talking about buying garbage assets just so you can be the garbage man. You will lose millions on the transaction fees alone." "I do not care about the money," I hissed, gripping the phone so tight the plastic creaked. "I want to own him. I want to own the chair he sits in. I want to own the roof over his head. I want to own the air conditioning that keeps his office cool while my son sweats in the bathroom. Buy it all, Kowalski. Every corporate loan, every personal lien, every overdue credit card bill. I want to be the only entity on this earth Richard Pendergast owes money to, and I want it done before the banks close today." "It will take some pulling," Kowalski grunted. "Pendergast is toxic. The banks will be happy to unload him, but they will want a premium for the speed of the transfer." "Pay it," I ordered. "Pay double if you have to. Just get me that paper. I want his signature on a document that belongs to me." "Consider it done," Kowalski said. "I will have the portfolio ready by tonight. And Conrad. What happy hunting. I snapped the phone shut. The sound was final, like the closing of a coffin lid. I put the truck in gear. The old engine roared to life, a beast waking up from a long slumber. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was a creditor. And I was coming to collect. The sun had long since set by the time I pulled up to the Sovereign, the high-rise apartment complex where my son lived. It was a fortress of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district, the kind of place where the air in the lobby was scented with white tea and the doorman wore a uniform that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. I parked my truck around the corner out of sight of the valets who would have sneered at the rust on the bumper. I walked into the lobby nodding to the concierge who recognized me not as the man in the flannel shirt, but as the name on the check for the $50,000 security deposit I had wired 3 years ago. That money was supposed to be a down payment on a house, a foundation for a future. Instead, Vanessa had insisted on renting this place because it had a skyline view and an address that impressed her yoga friends. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor. The ride was smooth, silent, and fast, a stark contrast to the turbulence churning in my gut. I had a key, a spare Toby had given me in secret one Christmas, whispering that he wanted me to have it just in case. I rarely used it. I didn't like coming here. The apartment felt like a museum, cold and curated, filled with white furniture you were afraid to sit on and art that looked like spilled paint. It smelled of expensive candles and pretension. But tonight, as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the air was different. It was heavy. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the high-backed armchair in the corner of the living room, a shadow in the darkness, and waited. The city lights bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, distorted shapes across the room. I looked at the wet bar stocked with crystal decanters. I looked at the silk rugs. I looked at the life my son was supposedly living, a life funded by my hard work and his misery. 20 minutes later, the electronic lock beeped. The door opened and Toby walked in. He didn't see me at first. He didn't turn on the lights either. He just leaned back against the heavy wooden door, closing his eyes and letting out a sigh that sounded like the air leaving a dying tire. He was still wearing the suit, but it was ruined. The fabric was stained with dark splotches of dirty water, and the knees were worn thin. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning, but it was the smell that hit me first. It drifted across the room, cutting through the scent of Vanessa's potpourri. It was the sharp, acrid stench of industrial bleach and public restroom disinfectant. It clung to his hair, his clothes, his skin. It was the smell of his humiliation. Toby peeled himself off the door and walked toward the kitchen, his steps heavy and dragging. As he passed through a shaft of moonlight, I saw his hands. He was trying to tuck them into his pockets, but he fumbled. They were raw. The skin was red and angry, cracked open at the knuckles where the harsh chemicals had eaten away the natural oils. His fingernails, usually so clean, were dark with grime he hadn't been able to scrub out. He looked at them with a mixture of shame and disgust, then quickly hid them behind his back as if he could feel my eyes on him. He went to the sink and turned on the tap, splashing cold water on his face. He scrubbed at his skin roughly, trying to wash away the day, trying to wash away the memory of his father-in-law standing over him. He didn't know I was there. He thought he was alone in his golden cage. He didn't know the door was already unlocked. He didn't know that the man sitting in the dark wasn't just a witness anymore. I was the judge, and the sentencing phase was about to begin. I cleared my throat, the sound startling him so badly, he dropped the glass he had just picked up. It shattered in the sink, a million glittering shards of crystal. Before Toby could even sweep up the shards of the broken glass, the electronic lock on the front door chirped. Panic flashed across his face, a raw terror that no son should ever feel in his own home. He looked at me silently, begging me to hide, to leave, to spare him the scene that was about to unfold. I didn't leave. I stepped back into the unlit hallway that led to the bedrooms, merging with the shadows. I needed to witness this. I needed to see exactly how they treated him when they thought no one was watching. The door swung open, and Vanessa marched in, followed closely by Richard, and a woman who looked like a faded photocopy of her daughter, draped in pearls and judgment. That was Cynthia Richards' wife. They swept into the apartment as if they owned it, bringing with them a gust of cold air and the noise of entitlement. They didn't greet Toby. They didn't ask about his day. They stepped around him as he knelt on the floor, picking up the crystal, treating him like an inconvenient obstacle in their path. "Dinner is late," Vanessa announced, tossing her designer bag onto the white sofa I had paid for. "And God, Toby, why does it smell like a chemical spill in here?" "I told you to shower at the gym before coming home. You are ruining the ambiance." "I am sorry," Toby murmured, standing up carefully with the jagged glass in his palm. "I just walked in. I will go change and start cooking." "No," Richard barked, heading straight for the head of the dining table. "We are starving. We spent all afternoon at the club celebrating. Serve the food. We ordered catering. It is in the kitchen. You can wash the stench off later." I watched from the dark as my son, a man with a master's degree and a heart of gold, went into the kitchen. He came back out carrying heavy silver platters of food that he hadn't eaten paid for, with money he didn't have. He moved like a ghost head down, placing the roast and the vegetables on the table. When the table was set, he pulled out a chair to sit down, his movements heavy with exhaustion. Vanessa's hand shot out and rested on the back of the chair, blocking him. "Not tonight, babe," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet poison. "We have important family business to discuss. Financial matters. And honestly, you smell too strong to sit at the table. It is unappetizing. Just stand by the sideboard and keep the wine flowing. Daddy is celebrating, and he hates an empty glass." Toby froze. He looked at the empty chair, then at his wife, then at the floor. For a heartbeat, I hoped he would throw the platter against the wall. Instead, he nodded. He swallowed his pride, a bitter pill he seemed used to taking, and retreated to the corner of the room. He picked up a bottle of red wine and stood at attention, a servant in his own home. Richard didn't even acknowledge him. He tucked a napkin into his collar and cut into his steak with savage enthusiasm. "Today was a banner day," he announced, chewing with his mouth open. I finally found him. The white whale. Cynthia sipped her wine, looking bored. "Who, dear?" "The investor." Richard grinned, grease shining on his chin. "A private equity fund called Blackwood Holdings. Some quiet, deep-pocketed outfit looking for a tax write-off. They contacted my office this afternoon. They want to inject $5 million, $5 million. That is enough to cover the payroll loans and get those vultures from the bank off my back for a year." I clenched my fists in the dark, my nails digging into my palms. Blackwood Holdings. He was bragging about my money. He was celebrating his salvation, completely unaware that he was toasting his own executioner. "They are sending a representative tomorrow morning to sign the papers." Richard continued, snapping his fingers in Toby's direction without looking at him. Toby rushed forward to refill the glass. "I am going to charm them. I will show them the projected growth. I will sell them the dream. And once that check clears, Cynthia, I am buying that boat we saw in Miami." Vanessa clapped her hands. "Oh, Daddy, that is amazing. I knew you would fix it. You are a genius." Toby was pouring the wine, but his hand was shaking from fatigue and hunger. A single drop of red wine splashed onto the white tablecloth. "Watch it, you idiot," Richard snapped, slapping Toby's hand away, hard enough to make the bottle rattle against the glass. "That is a vintage Merlot. It is worth more than your weekly salary." "Jesus, Vanessa, why did you marry this clumsy oaf? He can't clean a toilet properly, and he can't even pour a drink. He serves a purpose," Daddy, Vanessa said, spearing a piece of asparagus. "He is loyal, like a dog. And right now we need someone to fetch our slippers, don't we? Besides, the lease is in his name. If the ship goes down, he drowns, not us." Toby stood there, the bottle clutched to his chest, his face burning with a shame so deep it radiated across the room. He didn't look at his wife. He didn't look at the man insulting him. He just stared at the stain on the tablecloth, accepting the abuse as if it were his due. I had seen enough. I stepped back deeper into the shadows, my heart cold as stone. I knew the players. I knew the stakes. And now I knew exactly when to spring the trap. I waited in the shadows until the dinner party moved into the living room. Richard was loudly recounting a golf game, and Vanessa was laughing that high, fake laugh that grated on my nerves like sandpaper. Toby remained in the dining room, silently clearing the plates. He looked like a ghost, moving with a mechanical heaviness that spoke of a spirit completely crushed. He scraped the leftovers into the trash, his hands trembling, before wiping down the table where he wasn't allowed to sit. When he finished, he didn't join them. He opened the sliding glass door and stepped out onto the balcony, seeking the cold night air, as if it were oxygen for a drowning man. I followed him. The wind on the 42nd floor was biting, whipping around the concrete corners of the building. Toby was leaning over the railing, his knuckles white as he gripped the metal bar, staring down at the city lights below, as if wondering what it would be like to just let go. I stepped up beside him. I didn't say a word at first. I just let my presence register. He jumped, spinning around with a gasp, his eyes wide with fear. When he saw it was me, his shoulders slumped, but the terror didn't leave his eyes. "Dad, you have to go," he whispered, glancing frantically back at the sliding glass door. "If Vanessa sees you here, she will kill me. She said you are banned from the apartment." "Let her try," I said, my voice low and steady. "But I am not leaving until you tell me the truth. Not the lies you tell yourself to get through the day. The real truth. Why, Toby? Why are you letting them treat you like a dog in your own home? Why are you scrubbing toilets for a man who hates you? You have a degree. You have talent. You have a father who would burn the world down for you. Why are you submitting to this?" Toby looked away, biting his lip until it turned white. He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering in the cold. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "It is complicated." "It is not complicated," I snapped, grabbing his shoulder and forcing him to look at me. "It is abuse. They are destroying you. Walk away, son. Pack a bag right now. We will go to my house. We will figure it out." "I can't," he cried out, the sound ripped from his throat. "Dad, she is pregnant." The wind seemed to stop. I stared at him, searching his face. "Pregnant?" "Yes," he whispered, tears spilling over his lashes. "She told me last week. She is 8 weeks along. We are having a baby. A son." I looked at his earnest, tortured face and my heart broke. He believed it. He believed it with every fiber of his being. But I remembered the intel Kowalski had sent me. I remembered the photos of Vanessa drinking wine at lunch. I remembered the timeline. She told me that if I quit, if I walk away, if I show even an inch of disrespect to her father, she will file for divorce the next morning. Toby continued, the words tumbling out in a rush of panic. "She has the lawyers, Dad. She has the money. She said she would paint me as unstable. She said she would get full custody and I would never see my child. She said she would raise him to hate me." He grabbed my lapels, his grip desperate. I grew up with a father who was my hero. I grew up knowing what it meant to be loved. I cannot let my son grow up without that. I cannot let him grow up thinking his father abandoned him. So if I have to scrub toilets, if I have to serve wine, if I have to let Richard use me as a punching bag for the rest of my life, I will do it. I will do whatever it takes to be there for my kid. I pulled him into a hug, holding him tight as he sobbed into my shoulder. I held him not just to comfort him, but to hide the look on my face. Because I knew the truth. I knew she was using his best quality, his love, as a weapon against him. She had trapped him in a cage built of his own honor. "You are a good father, Toby," I whispered into the darkness. better than they deserve, but you are not going to be a punching bag forever. I pulled back, looking him in the eye. I didn't tell him what I knew. Not yet. It would break him completely. I needed him to be angry, not devastated. I needed him to see the chains for himself. Is that the only reason? I asked. Is the baby the only hold they have on you? Toby wiped his face, taking a shuddering breath. No, he said, reaching into his pocket. There is something else. The contract. You need to see the contract. Toby reached into the inside pocket of his ruined suit jacket and pulled out a folded document that was damp with sweat and smelled faintly of the toilet water he had been kneeling in. Read this, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Richard made me sign it this morning before he let me start cleaning. He said it was standard procedure for new hires. He said if I didn't sign it, I couldn't start, and if I didn't start, I wasn't providing for the baby. I took the papers, my hands trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the anticipation of what I was about to find. The light from the living room spilled out onto the balcony, just enough for me to read the fine print. It was an employment agreement, standard at a glance, but malicious in every detail. At the top in bold letters, it didn't say Director of Sales. It said Probationary Maintenance Associate. The salary listed was $12 an hour. No benefits. No overtime. It was a joke. A bad one. Toby, I said, pointing at the wage line with a calloused finger. This is less than what I pay the kid who mows my lawn. You have a master's degree. You are scrubbing floors for pocket change. Keep reading, Toby said, staring down at his shoes as if he couldn't bear to look at the paper. Page 4, paragraph 18. Vanessa stood over me while I signed it. She said it was just legal jargon to protect the company assets. I flipped the page. My eyes scanned the dense blocks of text, the kind designed to bore you into submission so you stop reading. But I didn't stop. I read every word. And then I saw it. The clause was buried in the middle of a section about equipment usage, hidden like a landmine in a field of grass. The employee agrees to assume full personal liability for all unsecured credit lines and operational debts incurred by the subsidiary entity known as Pendergast Holdings LLC, effective immediately upon signature. I stopped breathing for a second. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This wasn't a job offer. It was a death warrant. Pendergast Holdings. I knew that name from the report Kowalski had sent me. It was the shell company where Richard dumped all his toxic assets. It was the drain where the money disappeared. It was a black hole of debt. And by signing this, Toby hadn't just agreed to clean toilets. He had agreed to take the fall for millions of dollars in bad loans. I looked up at my son, a wave of nausea rolling through me. They weren't just humiliating him. They were setting him up. They knew the ship was sinking. They knew the creditors were circling. They needed a body to throw to the wolves so they could escape with their personal fortunes intact. They were going to pin the bankruptcy, the fraud, the embezzlement, all of it on Toby. They were going to send my son to prison for their crimes. Did you read this part? I asked, my voice shaking with a cold, hard fury. Did you understand what this meant? Toby shook his head, looking miserable. I tried to read it, Dad. But Richard was yelling at me to hurry up, and Vanessa was crying, saying I didn't trust her family. She said it was a test of loyalty. She said if I loved her and the baby, I would just sign it. So I signed it. A test. It wasn't a test. It was a trap. They had weaponized his love. They had used his honor against him to turn him into the perfect scapegoat. I folded the contract and put it in my pocket. I didn't give it back to him. This was evidence. This was the smoking gun. You did good showing me this, I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Go back inside. Serve the wine. Do not say a word about this to anyone. Act like nothing happened. Toby looked at me confused and scared. What are you going to do, Dad? I looked past him through the glass doors where Richard was laughing and drinking wine that my son had poured. "I am going to get a second opinion." I lied. "Go." As he slipped back inside looking like a man marching to the gallows, I knew the time for mercy was over. They wanted to play with contracts. Fine. I was about to rewrite the terms of their existence. The neon sign of Joe's Diner buzzed in the pre-dawn mist, a flickering red beacon in the gray morning. It was 6 o'clock, a time for honest laborers and insomniacs. I was both. I walked in the bell above the door, jingling a tired welcome, and saw Kowalski in the back booth. He looked out of place in his sharp charcoal suit among the truckers and night shift nurses, but he didn't care. He had a stack of manila folders in front of him, thick enough to choke a horse. I sat down opposite him. The waitress, a woman named Marge, who had been pouring coffee here since I laid the foundation for the city library, filled my mug without asking. I didn't drink it. I looked at Kowalski. "Tell me," I said. Kowalski didn't waste time with pleasantries. He never did. That was why I paid him $500 an hour. He opened the top folder and spun it around on the Formica table so I could read the spreadsheet. The ink was red. All of it. "Pendergast Logistics is not a company." "Conrad," he said, tapping the paper with a manicured finger. "It is a corpse. It has been dead for 5 years. Richard is just painting makeup on it to fool the banks." I looked at the bottom line. The number made my stomach turn. $12.4 million in debt. They were underwater. They were drowning. And they were using my son as a life raft. "How are they keeping the lights on?" I asked, my voice rough. "They aren't," Kowalski replied. "They are cycling loans. They take out a short-term loan from Bank A to pay the interest on Bank B. It is a classic Ponzi scheme, but with freight trucks. But here is the kicker." He flipped the page to a section highlighted in yellow. "Look at the operational expenses. See this recurring payment, $50,000 a month, to a firm called Sapphire Consulting." I nodded, squinting at the fine print. "Marketing?" I asked. Kowalski snorted a dry, cynical sound. "If by marketing you mean a 22-year-old cocktail waitress in Atlantic City, then yes. It is a shell company, Conrad. Richard is siphoning corporate funds directly into his mistress's pocket. And look here. Travel and entertainment. $2 million in the last 18 months. All of it spent at 3 specific casinos in Las Vegas. He isn't just bad at business. He is a degenerate gambler. He is bleeding the company dry to feed his addiction." I stared at the numbers. They were undeniable. Richard wasn't just a cruel father-in-law. He was a criminal. He was embezzling money that should have gone to paying his employees, embezzling money that should have secured his daughter's future to pay for his vices. And he was driving a Bentley while my son couldn't afford to buy lunch. "This explains the contract you showed me," Kowalski said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He knows the end is coming. The IRS is sniffing around. The banks are getting nervous. He needs a fall guy. He needs someone with the title of director to sign the next round of fraudulent loan applications. When the house of cards collapses, which it will in less than a month, he wants Toby's name on the rubble, not his. He wants your son to go to federal prison for him." I closed the folder. The rage I felt was different now. It wasn't hot. It was absolute zero. They weren't just abusing Toby. They were actively framing him. They were going to sacrifice my boy to save their own skins. "Is there anything left to salvage?" I asked. Kowalski shook his head. "Nothing. The assets are fully leveraged. The trucks are leased. The warehouse is mortgaged 3 times over. The only thing of value left is the Pendergast name, and Richard has dragged that through the mud." "Good," I said, standing up. I threw a $20 bill on the table for the coffee I hadn't touched. "That makes my job easier. I don't have to destroy his company, Kowalski. He already did it for me. I just have to make sure he is the one buried in the wreckage when it falls. Get the paperwork ready. We are going to buy a nightmare." Kowalski wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second, thinner envelope. This one wasn't manila. It was black. He didn't slide it across the table like he had the financial reports. He placed it gently in front of me, his expression softening for the first time since I had known him. He looked at me with the kind of pity you save for a man who is about to watch his house burn down with his family inside. "You need to see this, Conrad," he said quietly. "The financial fraud is just business. This part is personal." I opened the envelope. Inside were photographs. High-resolution, grainy in the way that long-distance surveillance shots always are, but clear enough to break a heart. The first photo showed Vanessa. She wasn't at the office. She wasn't at the charity gala she had told Toby she was organizing. She was standing outside the St. Regis Hotel, a place that charged $600 a night, just to breathe the air in the lobby. She was wearing a red dress I had never seen before, and she was laughing. But she wasn't alone. Standing next to her with his hand resting possessively on the small of her back was a man I recognized from the company website. Marcus Sterling, the chief financial officer of Pendergast Logistics. The man who was supposed to be auditing the books was busy auditing my daughter-in-law. I flipped through the rest of the stack. Vanessa and Sterling entering the elevator. Vanessa and Sterling at a candlelit dinner. Vanessa and Sterling kissing in a parked car. It wasn't a fling. It was a partnership. They were stealing the money together, and they were spending it on each other while my sons scraped their filth off the bathroom floor. "It gets worse," Kowalski said, pointing to a photo at the bottom of the stack. "Look at the date stamp on this one. It was taken 2 days ago. Tuesday. The same day Toby told me she was pregnant." I looked at the image. It was Vanessa sitting at an outdoor bistro wearing sunglasses. In front of her was a bottle of expensive white wine. She was holding a glass half empty up to her lips. "Pregnant women do not drink Chardonnay," Conrad Kowalski said, his voice hard. "At least not women who actually want to have a baby." I did some digging. I checked her pharmacy records. She is still refilling her birth control prescription. She picked up a 3-month supply last week. The room spun. The pregnancy. The baby. The grandson I had already started loving in my heart. It was all a lie. It was nothing more than a tactical nuke she had dropped on Toby to keep him in line. She knew he was close to breaking. She knew he was thinking about leaving. So she invented a child to chain him to that apartment, to chain him to that debt, to chain him to her father's failing empire. She was using a non-existent child as a hostage. I felt a coldness spread through my veins that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the diner. This was evil, pure distilled evil. She wasn't just a cheater. She was a sociopath. She was destroying a good man, her husband, methodically and without a shred of conscience, just to keep her lifestyle afloat for a few more months. "Is it possible it is not Toby's?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "If she is pregnant, is it Sterling's?" Kowalski shook his head. "With the birth control and the wine, I doubt there is a baby at all. But if there is, the timeline matches her trips to Atlantic City with Sterling more than her nights at home with Toby. Either way, your son is being played. She is leveraging his decency against him. She knows he won't leave a pregnant wife. She is banking on his honor." I put the photos back in the black envelope. I didn't tear them up. I didn't throw them. I treated them with reverence because they were the keys to my son's freedom. "Does Sterling know about the plan to frame Toby?" I asked. Kowalski nodded. "Sterling wrote the plan. He drafted the contract Toby signed. He is the architect of the financial ruin. Richard is just the greedy face of the operation. Sterling and Vanessa are the brains." I stood up, tucking the black envelope inside my jacket right next to my heart. It burned there, a reminder of the work that had to be done. They thought they were the predators. They thought Toby was the prey. But they had forgotten to check if the prey had a guardian. Do not release this yet, I told Kowalski. If we show Toby now, he might snap. He might do something rash. We need to cut the head off the snake first. What is the next move? Kowalski asked, gathering his files. We give them exactly what they want, I said, walking toward the door. They want a savior. They want $5 million. Let's give them a meeting. But make sure they know the terms. The investor demands absolute transparency, and he wants to sign the deal tomorrow. I stood in the parking lot of the diner, the morning sun finally breaking through the gray mist, but it brought no warmth to my skin. The black envelope in my inside pocket felt like a block of ice against my ribs. Every instinct I had as a father was screaming at me to drive straight to that overpriced apartment, kick down the door, and show Toby the pictures. I wanted to show him the monster he was sleeping next to. I wanted to drag him out of there by his collar and never look back. But I stopped myself, my hand hovering over the door handle of my rusted truck. Emotion is the enemy of strategy. If I went to Toby now, he would be devastated, yes. He would be heartbroken, but he would still be legally liable. That contract he signed yesterday, the one making him the fall guy for the debt, was binding. If I exposed Richard and Vanessa now, they would panic. They would circle the wagons. They would sue. They would drag this out in court for years, and during that time they would pin every cent of that $12 million debt on my son. They would ruin his credit, his reputation, and his future before the first gavel fell. They would burn him alive to save themselves. No. A rescue mission wasn't enough. I needed a clean kill. I needed to cut the head off the snake so quickly it wouldn't even realize it was dead until it tried to strike. I turned back to Kowalski, who was lighting a cigarette by his sleek black sedan. He looked like exactly what he was, a predator in a tailored suit. Do not send the photos to Toby, I said, my voice flat. Not yet. Kowalski raised an eyebrow, exhaling a thin plume of smoke. You are playing a dangerous game, Conrad. The longer she stays close to him, the more damage she can do. She is poison. She has already done the damage, I replied. She has killed his spirit. Now she is trying to steal his life. I am going to make sure she pays for both. I leaned against the hood of my truck, crossing my arms over my chest. Here is the play. You are the face of Blackwood Holdings. You are the shark from the city. You call Richard right now. Tell him the due diligence is done. Tell him the board is impressed by his projections. Tell him whatever lies you need to tell to make him feel like a genius. And the $5 million, Kowalski asked. Offer it, I said. Tell him we are ready to wire the full $5 million to capitalize the company immediately. But there is a catch. There is always a catch. Kowalski smiled, a shark smelling blood in the water. And what is the catch? Urgency, I said. Tell him the offer expires in 24 hours. Tell him we have another acquisition target in Hong Kong and the capital is moving fast. If he wants the money, he has to sign the deal tomorrow morning. At his office. In person. Kowalski nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. You want to rush him. You want him so blinded by the cash he doesn't read the fine print. Exactly, I said. Desperate men don't read contracts. They just count the zeros. I want him to think he has won the lottery. I want him to be so arrogant, so sure of his own brilliance, that he signs his own death warrant without a second thought. And Kowalski, one more thing. Yeah, make sure he knows the terms are non-negotiable. And tell him the chairman of the board wants to inspect the facilities personally before the wire is sent. Tell him I am a stickler for cleanliness. Kowalski chuckled, dropping his cigarette and crushing it under his polished heel. You are enjoying this, aren't you? I looked at the sunrise, thinking of my son on his knees with that toothbrush. I am not enjoying it, I said. I am just finishing it. Make the call. I watched as Kowalski pulled out his phone and dialed. I saw his posture shift, becoming the arrogant, high-powered financier. I heard him say, Mr. Pendergast, good news. I got into my truck and drove away. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for the rat to take the cheese. I sat in the cab of my truck, the windows rolled up to block out the noise of the waking city. Kowalski sat in his sedan next to me, his phone connected to the Bluetooth system, so I could hear every word. He dialed. It rang 3 times before Richard picked up. Pendergast, Richard barked, his voice tight, with the stress of a man juggling $12 million in debt. He sounded like a cornered animal trying to roar. Mr. Pendergast, Kowalski said, his voice smooth as silk and cold as ice. This is Arthur Kowalski. I am the senior portfolio manager for Blackwood Holdings. There was a pause on the line. I held my breath. Blackwood. It was my name. It was my son's name. It was the name Richard had spit on just hours ago. I waited for the recognition. I waited for him to connect the dots, to realize that the old man in the flannel shirt and the multi-million-dollar equity fund shared the same identity. But Richard didn't pause because he was suspicious. He paused because he was confused. Blackwood Richard asked, the aggression leaving his voice replaced by a hungry curiosity. I don't believe we have met, Mr. Kowalski. We haven't. Kowalski lied effortlessly. We are a private boutique firm. We specialize in distressed assets and logistical turnarounds. My analysts have been watching your company, Mr. Pendergast. We see potential. I could almost hear Richard's chest swelling through the speakers. He didn't hear distressed assets. He heard potential. He heard an ego stroke. Of course you do, Richard said, his tone shifting instantly to his salesman persona, slick and oily. We are poised for massive growth. We just need the right liquidity partner to unlock the next phase. Exactly, Kowalski said. And we want to be that partner. We are prepared to offer a capital injection of $5 million. I heard a sound that might have been Richard choking on his morning scotch. $5 million, he sputtered. Liquid immediate wire transfer upon signature, Kowalski confirmed. Oh, thank God, Richard whispered, his hand likely covering the receiver, but not well enough. He came back on the line, his voice trembling with a greed so potent it was almost palpable. That sounds acceptable, Mr. Kowalski. We are certainly open to a partnership. When can we meet to discuss the terms? We don't have time for discussions, Mr. Pendergast, Kowalski said, snapping the trap shut. The Capital Allocation Committee is meeting in 48 hours. We have another target in Hong Kong. If you want this money, we need to close now. I have the contract ready. I can be at your office tomorrow morning at 9. If the papers aren't signed by 10, the offer is rescinded and the capital goes to Asia. Tomorrow, Richard squeaked. Yes, absolutely. 9 is perfect. I will clear my schedule. I will have my legal team. No legal team, Kowalski cut in sharply. This is a standard boilerplate agreement. If you bring in lawyers to redline it, we will miss the funding window. You sign it as is or we walk. Take it or leave it. There was zero hesitation, not a second of caution. Desperation had made him blind. I will sign it, Richard said quickly. Bring the check. Excellent, Kowalski said. One last thing. The chairman of the board is old-fashioned. He is a stickler for presentation. He wants to inspect the headquarters personally before authorizing the wire. He hates mess. Richard laughed, a nervous, giddy sound. My offices are pristine, Mr. Kowalski. We run a tight ship. Tell the chairman he will be impressed. I looked at Kowalski through the window of his car. He winked at me. I sat back in my seat staring at the phone. Richard Pendergast had just sold his soul to the devil he thought was his savior. He was so happy about the money he didn't even realize he had just invited his executioner into his home. He had no idea that Blackwood Holdings wasn't a bank. It was a sledgehammer, and I was the one swinging it. I watched Kowalski through the window of his sedan. He hadn't hung up yet. He was reeling Richard in inch by inch, letting the greed set the hook deep in his jaw. I signaled him to drop the final weight. Kowalski nodded, checking his reflection in the rearview mirror as if preparing for a stage performance. "Mr. Pendergast." He said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming confidential, almost conspiratorial. "Before we finalize the time, there is a personal eccentricity of the chairman you must be aware of. It is non-negotiable." I could hear Richard's breath hitch on the speakerphone. "Anything, Mr. Kowalski. Whatever he needs. Does he need a specific brand of water?" "A private entrance," No Kowalski replied, his tone dry. "The chairman is a man of peculiar standards. He believes that the state of a company's back end reflects the state of its ledger. He has, let's call it, an extreme sensitivity to disorder, germs, mess. He is obsessive-compulsive about hygiene." I smiled in the darkness of my truck cab. It wasn't true, of course. I have eaten sandwiches with hands covered in concrete dust. But Richard didn't know that. Richard only knew that $5 million was dangling in front of him, and he would jump through a ring of fire to get it. I see Richard stammered. "Well, our cleaning crew comes in at night." "The offices are night crews cut corners." Kowalski interrupted, his voice sharpening. "The chairman does not tolerate cut corners. When he arrives tomorrow morning to sign the check, he will not be looking at your spreadsheets first. He will be looking at your facilities, specifically the restrooms. If he finds a single water spot on a mirror or a scuff mark on the tile, he will walk out, and he will take his checkbook with him." "Do I make myself clear, crystal clear?" Richard said, his voice vibrating with a manic energy. "I assure you, the restrooms will be surgical suites. I will personally oversee the preparation." "Good," Kowalski said. "Because if the environment does not meet his standards, he takes it as a personal insult. And he destroys companies that insult him." 9 a.m., Mr. Pendergast. Do not make us wait, and do not make us see dirt." Kowalski ended the call. The silence in the parking lot was heavy. He looked over at me and gave a thumbs up. It was done. The stage was set. Richard Pendergast, a man who thought he was too good to hold a door open for a lady, was now terrified of a speck of dust. I knew exactly what his next move would be. He wasn't going to hire a professional cleaning crew. That would cost money he didn't want to spend, and it wouldn't give him the satisfaction he craved. He needed someone he could control, someone he could blame if things went wrong, someone he could abuse without consequence. He wasn't going to pick up a mop himself. He was going to call my son. I checked my watch. It was 2:55 in the morning. Toby would be asleep in that cold, expensive apartment, probably dreaming of a way out. His phone was about to ring, and the nightmare was about to start all over again. I started my truck. I needed to get into position. I wanted to be there when my son walked into the trap I had laid, not to stop it, but to witness the moment Richard Pendergast sealed his own fate. I sat in the cab of my truck, the engine off the block cooling with soft metallic ticks that sounded like a countdown in the silence of the night. I was parked across the street from the Sovereign, hidden in the shadows of a construction scaffolding I knew was structurally unsound, because I used to spot check half the sites in this city. The digital clock on my dashboard read 3:02 in the morning, the witching hour, the time when normal people are deep in REM sleep, dreaming of better things. But Richard Pendergast was not a normal person. He was a man with $12 million of debt hanging over his head like a guillotine blade, and he had just been told the executioner was coming at 9 a.m. A light flicked on in the third-floor window of the apartment complex. It was harsh and yellow against the darkness. I saw a silhouette move frantically behind the sheer curtains. It was Toby. He was awake. My phone remained silent, but I knew exactly what was happening inside that apartment because I had engineered it. Richard wasn't sleeping. He was pacing his office, sweating through his silk pajamas, terrified that a water spot on a mirror would cost him his empire. And because he was a bully, his fear manifested as aggression toward the only person he could control. I could almost hear the phone call in my head. I could imagine the shrill ringtone cutting through the quiet of the bedroom, waking Toby from the few hours of restless sleep he had managed to snatch. I could see him fumbling for the receiver, his heart pounding, thinking it was an emergency. And it was. Just not the kind he expected. "Get up," Richard would be screaming, his voice tight with panic. "Get your ass down to the office. Now!" "But it is 3 in the morning, Toby would stammer, confused, exhausted, his hands still raw from the day before. "I don't care what time it is," Richard would roar. "The investor is coming at 9. He is a fanatic about hygiene. If he sees a single smudge on that chrome, if he smells anything other than lavender and success, he walks. And if he walks, we are finished. You are going to go down there and you are going to scrub until your fingers bleed, if that is what it takes." I watched as the shadow in the window slumped. Toby was arguing, likely pleading for a few more hours of rest. But then Richard played his trump card. The card I knew he held. The card that turned this from a bad job into a hostage situation. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little parasite," Richard said. I imagined his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. "Do not think you have a choice. Do you remember that contract you signed yesterday, the one you didn't bother to read? That wasn't just employment paperwork. That was a transfer of liability. I put every bad loan, every toxic credit line, and every cent of the $12 million of debt this company holds onto your signature." I saw Toby's silhouette freeze against the window. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "If this deal falls through," Richard continued, twisting the knife, "I file for bankruptcy. But not for me. For the subsidiary you now legally own. I walk away clean. You go to federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. You will rot in a cell while your child grows up calling another man daddy. So get in your car, get down to my building, and make that toilet shine like the crown jewels. Do it or say goodbye to your freedom." The light in the apartment stayed on for another 5 minutes. Then it went dark. A moment later, the lobby doors of the high-rise opened. My son walked out. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing old gray sweatpants and a hoodie, carrying a plastic bucket of his own cleaning supplies, because he knew Richard wouldn't even procede fish rags. He looked like a ghost, pale and shaking, moving with the jerky, unnatural motions of a man in shock. He got into his cheap sedan, the engine coughing as it started, and drove away toward the office. He was driving to his own torture chamber because he believed he was saving his family. He didn't know he was driving into the middle of a war zone. I waited until his taillights disappeared around the corner. I didn't follow him. I didn't need to. I gripped the steering wheel, my leather gloves creaking. Richard had just threatened my son with prison. He had crossed the line from cruelty to criminality. He thought he was motivating an employee. He didn't realize he had just handed me the motive for his own destruction. I started the truck. It was time to get into position. The sun would be up soon, and I had a front row seat to the end of the Pendergast dynasty. I drove my truck to a private storage unit on the outskirts of the city, a nondescript brick building with no windows and a steel gate that required a retina scan. I parked the Ford inside next to a collection of vehicles that would have made a collector weep. I walked past the vintage Mustang and the Ferrari I hadn't driven in a decade. I stopped in front of the beast, a black Rolls-Royce Phantom, sleek, silent, and imposing as a hearse. I hadn't taken it out in 2 years. It was a car for kings and tyrants, and today I needed to be both. I slid into the driver's seat. The smell of hand-stitched leather and polished wood filled my senses, a stark departure from the scent of old oil and sawdust I was used to. The engine started with a whisper, a ghost of power compared to the roar of my truck. I drove out into the night, the suspension swallowing the potholes of the city streets as if they didn't exist. I wasn't just changing vehicles. I was changing skins. The contractor was gone. The billionaire had arrived. I parked the Phantom in the alley behind the Pendergast building, tucked deep into the shadows where the streetlights couldn't reach. It was 3:45 in the morning. The city was dead quiet, that heavy, suffocating silence before the dawn. I sat there, the darkness inside the car absolute, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I wasn't shaking anymore. I was stone. 10 minutes later, headlights swept across the brick wall opposite me. Toby's battered sedan limped into the rear parking lot. He parked far away from the entrance, as if he felt he didn't deserve to be close to the building. I watched through the tinted glass as he got out. He looked like a man marching to his own execution. He was wearing gray sweatpants that were too short and a hoodie that had seen better days. He dragged a plastic bucket out of his trunk, his movements slow and jerky. He stopped at the service door, took a deep breath that made his shoulders shudder, and swiped his keycard. The red light blinked green. He disappeared inside. I gripped the leather wheel so hard the leather creaked. It took every ounce of discipline I had accumulated over 72 years not to open the door, march in there, and drag him out. I wanted to tell him that he didn't have to do this. I wanted to tell him that I could buy this building with the cash in my checking account. I wanted to tell him that he was safe, but I forced myself to stay put. If I saved him now, he would be grateful, but he wouldn't be free. He would still think he owed them. He would still think he was the one who failed. He needed to see the end. He needed to see Richard sign that paper. He needed to see the monster unmasked, not just defeated. I watched the windows on the ground floor. A light flickered on in the men's room. My son was in there on his knees again, scrubbing away imaginary dirt to please a man who viewed him as livestock. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the headrest. I meditated on the rage. I let it fill me up cold and heavy like liquid nitrogen. I visualized Richard's face when he realized who I was. I visualized Vanessa's face when she realized the ATM was closed forever. The sky began to turn a bruised purple in the east. Dawn was coming. The deadline was approaching. Inside that building, Richard Pendergast was probably pacing his office, checking his watch, terrified that his savior wouldn't show up. He had no idea that his savior was sitting in the alley watching his destruction unfold in slow motion. He thought he was preparing for a lifeline. He didn't know he was preparing for a funeral, and I was going to be the one delivering the eulogy. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The eyes staring back weren't the eyes of a kind old father. They were the eyes of a shark. The wait was almost over. 0 hour was approaching. At 7 o'clock sharp, the silence inside the Rolls-Royce was shattered by the shrill ringtone of my personal cell phone. It sat on the passenger seat, vibrating against the hand-stitched leather like an intrusive insect. The screen flashed, "Vanessa." I stared at it for a moment. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the alley where I waited. Inside the building, my son was likely on his hands and knees, scrubbing away the last of his dignity. And now the predator was calling to see if she could squeeze a little more blood from the stone. I picked up the phone, taking a breath to steady my voice, to slip back into the persona of the weary, defeated old man they thought I was. "Hello," I answered, making my voice sound groggy and fearful. "Dad." "Oh God, Dad, you have to help us." Vanessa's voice burst through the speaker, high-pitched and hysterical. She was crying, or at least she was making the noises people make when they want you to think they are crying. It was a performance worthy of daytime television. "It is Toby. He has done something terrible." My grip tightened on the phone. "What, is he hurt?" I asked, feigning the panic of a worried father. "No, he isn't hurt, but he is in so much trouble," she sobbed. "He was cleaning Daddy's office. He was trying to be helpful, and he knocked over the vase. The antique Ming vase Daddy bought at auction last year. It shattered, Dad. It is in a million pieces." I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the headrest. A vase. Toby wasn't even allowed in the executive offices. He was confined to the restrooms. And Richard Pendergast didn't own a Ming vase. He owned replicas he bought online to impress people who didn't know better. It was a lie. A lazy, desperate lie fabricated to extract quick cash before the investor arrived. Richard is furious, Vanessa continued, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. He is screaming. He says it is criminal property damage. He has the phone in his hand, Dad. He is dialing the police. He says he is going to have Toby arrested. He says he is going to press charges for destruction of corporate property. Arrested, I stammered. For an accident, Daddy says it wasn't an accident. He says it was negligence. He says unless we can pay the deductible for the insurance right now, he is sending Toby to jail. She paused for effect, letting the threat hang in the air. He wants $10,000, Dad. Right now. If we give him the money, he won't call the cops. But we don't have it. Our accounts we are tight right now. Please, Dad. You have to save him. Do you have it? Can you send it $10,000? That was the price of my son's freedom in her mind. It was a shakedown. She wanted a payday. She probably wanted a new bag or a dress to impress the new investor. She was ransoming my son with a fake crime. 10,000, I asked, my voice trembling. Vanessa, that is. That is my emergency fund. That is my retirement savings. Please, she wailed. Do you want Toby to go to prison? Do you want your grandson to be born while his father is behind bars? Just wire it. I will text you the account number. Please hurry. He is talking to the operator. I looked out the window at the brick wall of the warehouse. Okay, I said, sounding defeated. Okay, I will do it. Send me the info. I will go to the bank app now. Just tell him to stop. Tell him I am paying. Thank you, Dad. She breathed, the hysteria instantly vanishing, replaced by a sharp, business-like efficiency. Hurry. I will send the details. She hung up. I stared at the phone. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't care that she was taking an old man's life savings. She just wanted the cash. I opened my banking app. I had the money. I had millions. But I wasn't going to send it from my main account. I transferred $10,000 from a decoy account I used for small expenses. But before I hit send, I tagged the transfer. I attached a digital tracer code Kowalski had set up for me. It wouldn't stop the money from moving, but it would tell me exactly where it went the moment it landed. I typed in the account number she texted me. It wasn't Richard's corporate account. It wasn't even a joint account with Toby. It was a private account in her name only. I hit transfer. The screen flashed, success. I put the phone down. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a hunter who had just baited a trap. She thought she had just scammed a foolish old man. She didn't know she had just created a digital paper trail of extortion. She had just handed me the weapon I needed to destroy her. Now I just had to wait and see what she bought with her 30 pieces of silver. I stared at the phone screen, my thumb hovering over the transfer button, letting the silence stretch out. I needed her to sweat. I needed her to feel the panic she was trying to inflict on me. Vanessa, I said, forcing a tremor into my voice that sounded pathetic even to my own ears. That money, that is everything. That is the money for my property taxes. If I send this, I might lose the house. It was a lie, of course. My house was paid off in 1998. But I wanted to see how far she would go. I wanted to see if there was a bottom to her well of selfishness. Dad, seriously? She snapped, her voice losing the weeping quality and turning sharp and annoyed. You can live in a trailer for all I care. Toby is about to go to jail. Are you really comparing your dusty old shack to your son's freedom? Stop being selfish. Just hit the button. Selfish. The word almost made me laugh. She was demanding $10,000 for a crime that didn't happen to pay a father who was currently blackmailing his own employee, and she called me selfish. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Okay, I whispered, sounding defeated. Okay, I am doing it. Please just promise me Richard won't hurt him. Just send it, she screamed. I switched apps on my secure phone. I didn't go to my personal savings. I went to a dedicated account Kowalski had set up for what he called high-risk transactions. It was a honeypot. The money in that account was real, but it was marked. Every cent that left that account was tagged with a digital tracer code, a piece of banking software usually reserved for federal investigations. It didn't just move money. It tracked the destination routing number, the merchant category codes, and the exact time of expenditure. It was a digital die pack. I typed in the $10,000. I typed in the account number she had texted me. I took a deep breath, not because I was worried about the money, but because I was about to seal her fate. This wasn't a loan. It was an investment in my son's divorce settlement. I am sending it now, I said. God forgive you if you are lying to me, Vanessa. I am not lying, she shrieked, though the lie was so big, it practically distorted the signal. I pressed confirm. The screen swirled for a second, then flashed a green checkmark. Transfer complete. It is done, I said, my voice heavy. It is gone. That is every penny I have. Hold on, she said, her voice suddenly calm, efficient. I could hear her tapping on a keyboard in the background. She was checking her mobile banking. Okay, I see it. It is pending. Good. Is Toby safe? I asked. Is Richard putting the phone down? Yeah, sure, whatever, she said dismissively. Richard is calming down. I have to go, Dad. I have to deal with this mess you people created. Don't call us. We will call you. The line went dead. She didn't say thank you. She didn't promise to pay me back. She didn't even pretend to care that she had just financially ruined an old man. She got the cash, and I ceased to exist. I lowered the phone and looked at the dashboard of the Rolls-Royce. I wasn't sad. I wasn't worried. I felt a cold, hard satisfaction. She thought she had won. She thought she had pulled off the perfect shakedown. She had no idea she had just accepted a Trojan horse. I opened the tracking app Kowalski had installed. A bright blue dot appeared on the map of the city. It was currently sitting at the Sovereign Apartments, but it wouldn't stay there. Money like that burns a hole in the pocket of someone like Vanessa. She wouldn't pay Richard. She wouldn't pay an insurance deductible. She would treat herself. She would justify it as stress relief. I sat back in the leather seat and watched the blue dot. Go on, I whispered to the screen. Go spend it. Buy something nice. Buy the evidence that will bury you. I did not have to wait long. 15 minutes after Vanessa hung up, the tracking app on my secure phone chirped. It was a cheerful, innocent sound, the kind you might hear when a friend sends a text message, but the information it delivered was a death sentence for Vanessa's credibility. A notification banner slid across the screen, the white letters stark against the black background. Transaction alert. Account ending in 4920. I tapped the screen, expanding the details. The map zoomed in the blue dot, moving from the apartment complex to the high-end shopping district downtown. It hovered over a specific address on 5th Avenue. I recognized the location. It wasn't a law firm. It wasn't an insurance agency. It wasn't even a bank. It was the Hermes boutique. I read the transaction line, and a cold smile touched my lips. Amount $9,800. Merchant Hermes Paris. Category luxury goods. Time 7:22 a.m. She hadn't even waited for the store to officially open. She must have called in a favor with a personal shopper desperate to turn my life savings into leather and gold hardware before the guilt set in. Or perhaps she didn't feel guilt at all. Perhaps she felt entitled. There was no broken Ming Vos. There was no furious father-in-law threatening to call the police. There was no legal emergency. There was just a woman with a hole in her soul that she tried to fill with expensive things, and she had used my son's fear and my money to do it. She had extorted $10,000 from an old man she believed was destitute, claiming it was to save her husband from jail, and she had spent it on a purse. It was breathtaking in its audacity. It was the kind of greed that makes you question humanity, but it was also the kind of mistake that wins lawsuits. I took a screenshot of the transaction. Then I opened the detailed log Kowalski's software provided. It showed the IP address of the device that authorized the payment. It matched Vanessa's phone. It showed the GPS coordinates. It was airtight. "Got you," I whispered. I didn't feel angry anymore. Anger is hot. It burns you up. This was something else. This was clarity. For 3 years, I had wondered if I was being too harsh, if I was judging her too quickly, because she was different from us. Now I knew. She wasn't different. She was a predator, and she had just walked into a cage. I forwarded the screenshot to Kowalski with a simple note. "Add this to the file. Extortion, fraud, grand larceny." His reply came back 30 seconds later. "Received. That is a felony, Conrad. We have her. Do you want me to call the police now?" "No," I typed back. "Not yet. Let her carry the bag. Let her walk into that meeting with her new prize on her arm. I want her to be holding the evidence when I take everything away from her." And I put the phone down and looked out at the city waking up. The morning light reflected off the glass towers, beautiful and cold. Somewhere in that concrete jungle, Vanessa was probably admiring her reflection in a shop window, thinking she had pulled off the perfect crime. She was preening. She was celebrating. She had no idea that the bag she just bought wasn't a trophy. It was an anchor, and she had just tied it around her own neck. I started the engine of the Rolls-Royce. The powerful motor purred a deep, resonant vibration that I felt in my chest. It was time to go. The meeting was at 9. The cast was assembled. The stage was set. The villain had made her move. Now it was time for the hero to enter not on a white horse but in a black phantom to deliver a reckoning they would never forget. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Vanessa," I said to the empty car, "because the bill is coming due." Inside the executive boardroom on the top floor, the atmosphere was brittle with nervous energy. It was 9 o'clock sharp. The room smelled of expensive leather polish and the stale, recycled air of desperation. Richard Pendergast stood at the head of the long mahogany table, adjusting his silk tie for the 10th time in a minute. He was sweating despite the air conditioning being cranked down to Arctic levels. Around him sat his board of directors, a collection of yes-men in gray suits, who looked like they were waiting for a firing squad or a lottery win, unsure which would come first. They had their laptops open, displaying graphs that I knew were fabricated, ready to sell a lie to the man they thought was their savior. Vanessa was there too. She sat to Richard's right, looking like the queen of a crumbling kingdom. She was wearing a white dress that looked crisp and professional, but on her arm, displayed prominently like a trophy, was the Hermes Birkin bag she had bought less than 2 hours ago. The black leather gleamed under the recessed lighting. She stroked the gold hardware absently, a subconscious comfort mechanism. She looked smug. She looked untouchable. She had no idea that the bag wasn't a status symbol. It was a signed confession of extortion sitting right on the table. But the most jarring element in the room wasn't the fraudulent graphs or the stolen purse. It was the figure standing in the far corner near the credenza that held the coffee service. It was my son. Richard hadn't let Toby change back into his street clothes. He hadn't sent him home to sleep after his night of forced labor. Instead, he had forced him into a final indignity. Toby was wearing a bright electric blue polyester jumpsuit, the kind worn by the night cleaning crew. It was 2 sizes too big, the fabric bunching around his ankles and wrists. On the breast pocket, a patch read, "Facilities Maintenance." He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, head bowed, trying to disappear into the beige wallpaper. He looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, his skin pale from stress and the fumes he had inhaled all night. When Kowalski walked into the room carrying his briefcase like a weapon, Richard practically leaped over the table to shake his hand. Mr. Kowalski. Welcome, Richard, boomed his voice, too loud, too eager. We are so honored you could make it. Please sit. Can I get you anything? Coffee, sparkling water. Kowalski didn't smile. He walked to the chair opposite Richard, set his briefcase down, and looked around the room with a cold, appraising stare. He ignored the board members. He ignored Vanessa. His eyes landed on Toby in the corner. He paused just for a fraction of a second, letting the silence stretch. I see you have staff present, Kowalski said, his voice neutral. Richard laughed, a nervous braying sound. Oh, don't mind him. That is just the help. I like to keep the service close at hand. We pride ourselves on hospitality here. He snapped his fingers at my son, a sharp cracking sound. Boy, water for Mr. Kowalski. And make sure the glass is clean this time. Toby flinched. He stepped forward, picking up a crystal pitcher of ice water. His hands were shaking. I could see the tremors from where I would soon be standing. He poured the water into a glass in front of Kowalski, careful not to spill a drop, moving with the terrifying obedience of a beaten dog. Vanessa didn't look away. She watched her husband serve the man she thought was rescuing her father, and she smiled. It was a small, cruel curving of her lips. She enjoyed this. She enjoyed seeing him reduced to a servant. It made her feel powerful. It justified her betrayal. That will be all. Stand back against the wall, Richard commanded, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. Toby retreated to his corner, blending back into the shadows. He didn't look angry. He looked resigned. He had accepted this reality. He believed this was his life now. He didn't know that the man sitting at the table, the man he was serving, was actually working for his father. He didn't know that the water he just poured was part of a ritual that was about to end, with the building coming down around Richard's ears. Kowalski took a sip of the water, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. Excellent service, he said dryly. Efficient. Now shall we discuss the future of this company? Or should I say, who owns it? Richard beamed, opening a leather folder. Absolutely. As you can see, our projections for the next quarter are aggressive. With your capital, Kowalski raised a hand, stopping him. We can skip the projections, Richard. I brought the agreement. It is ready for signature. But as I mentioned on the phone, the terms are strict. Richard waved a hand dismissively. Terms are just details, Arthur. I am ready to sign. Just show me where. Kowalski reached into his briefcase and pulled out a document. It was thick, bound in heavy blue paper. He slid it across the polished mahogany. It stopped right in front of Richard. It looked like a lifeline. It was actually a trapdoor. Richard reached for the gold fountain pen sitting on the table, his hand trembling with a mixture of greed and relief. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for a month and was finally allowed to exhale. He opened the heavy blue cover of the contract, ready to scribble his name on the bottom line and take the check that would solve all his problems. But Kowalski placed a heavy hand on the document, stopping the paper from moving. Not so fast, Richard Kowalski said, his voice calm and authoritative. The chairman insists on absolute clarity before ink meets paper. We are not a traditional bank. We do not rely on credit scores. We rely on character. Richard paused, the pen hovering inches above the page. Character, he repeated, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. Of course. We have excellent character here. Pendergast. Logistics is a family-value-driven enterprise. Kowalski flipped the document open to a page near the back. The text here was dense, packed tight, like bricks in a wall. He pointed a manicured finger at a paragraph halfway down the page, marked simply as Clause 47. Read this, Kowalski commanded softly. This is the Morality and Asset Verification Rider. It is unique to Blackwood Holdings. It states that if the borrower is found to have engaged in any material misrepresentation of assets, or if there is any breach of standard business ethics, including fraud, embezzlement, or gross negligence, the lender reserves the right to trigger an immediate default. Richard squinted at the small print, waving his hand dismissively. Standard boilerplate, Arthur. Every bank has a default clause. Kowalski leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Richard's. This is not standard. Read the penalty. Upon trigger of this clause, the lender assumes immediate and total control of all collateralized assets. That includes the company, the real estate, the inventory, and crucially, the personal assets of the primary signatories if corporate assets are insufficient to cover the debt. That means your house, your cars, your personal accounts. If you lied to us, Richard, we take everything, instantly. The room went silent. I saw Vanessa shift in her seat, her hand tightening around the handle of her stolen Hermes bag. For a second, a shadow of doubt crossed her face. She looked at Marcus Sterling, the CFO, who was sweating through his shirt. But Richard was too far gone. He was blinded by the $5 million. He didn't see a threat. He saw a formality he thought he could outsmart. I have nothing to hide, Richard declared, puffing out his chest. My books are open. My conscience is clear. This clause is irrelevant because I am a man of honor. He looked at the board members seeking validation. They nodded like bobbleheads, terrified to disagree. Then sign it, Kowalski said, removing his hand from the paper. Sign it, and the money is yours. But know this. Once you sign, there is no going back. The audit begins the moment the ink is dry. Richard didn't hesitate. He didn't look at his daughter. He didn't look at the son-in-law he was planning to frame. He pressed the gold nib to the paper and signed his name with a flourish. A large, arrogant signature that took up half the page. He sat back, a triumphant grin splitting his face. Done, he announced. Now where is my check? Kowalski pulled the document back across the table, checking the signature. He closed the folder with a soft thud. The sound echoed in the room like the closing of a prison cell. Thank you, Mr. Pendergast, Kowalski said. You have just legally authorized the transfer, but I think there is one more person who needs to review this transaction. Richard frowned, confused. Who the chairman is he here? Kowalski stood up and turned toward the door. No, he said. Not the chairman. The owner. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway. I wasn't wearing my flannel shirt and work boots. I was wearing a bespoke three-piece suit that cost more than Richard's car. I walked into the room, the silence stretching out before me, and I looked Richard Pendergast dead in the eye. Hello, Richard, I said, my voice filling the room. I believe you have something that belongs to me. The gold pen danced across the paper, a frantic, jagged scrawl that sealed his fate. Richard didn't even glance at Clause 47. He didn't look at the forfeiture terms. His eyes were glazed over, seeing only the imaginary pile of cash that was about to hit his bank account. He was signing away his life, his house, and his freedom, but in his mind, he was signing a victory treaty. He capped the pen with a decisive click, the sound of a lock snapping shut, though he thought it was the sound of a vault opening. He pushed the heavy folder back toward Kowalski, his chest puffing out with the returned arrogance of a man who believes he has cheated death. There, he declared, leaning back in his leather chair and clasping his hands behind his head. Signed, sealed, and delivered. Now I expect that wire transfer to hit my account within the hour. I have a boat to buy and a reputation to rebuild. The adrenaline of the moment made him feel invincible, and when Richard felt invincible, he needed to make someone else feel small. It was his nature. He swiveled his chair around, his eyes locking onto Toby, who was still standing in the corner, in that ridiculous, oversized blue jumpsuit holding the water pitcher like a shield. "Wake up, boy," Richard snapped, snapping his fingers. "Don't just stand there like a statue. Pour water for the gentleman, you useless idiot." Toby moved forward, his head down the picture of defeat. Richard watched him, come a sneer curling his lip. He gestured toward Kowalski, who was calmly putting the signed contract into his briefcase. "Look at this man, Toby," Richard said, his voice dripping with disdain. Learn from him. Look at Mr. Kowalski. He is a winner. He is a director of a major equity fund. He wears a suit that fits. He commands respect. He walks into a room and people listen. That is what success looks like. He laughed, a cruel barking sound that grated against the silence of the room. And then look at you. You are nothing but a janitor, a toilet scrubber. You have a degree on your wall, but you are only fit to wipe floors. You could have been something, but you are weak. That is why you are serving water, and he is signing checks. Vanessa giggled, covering her mouth with her hand, her eyes dancing with amusement. She reached out and patted Richard's arm. "Don't be too hard on him, Daddy," she cooed. "Someone has to clean up the mess. It is the only thing he is good at." Toby's hand shook as he refilled Richard's glass. A splash of water landed on the mahogany table. Richard slammed his hand down, making the glass jump. "You clumsy fool," he shouted. "You can't even do this right. Get out of my sight. Go back to the bathroom where you belong." Toby flinched, backing away, his face burning with shame. Richard turned back to Kowalski, a wide, fake smile plastered on his face. "My apologies, Mr. Kowalski. It is hard to find good help these days, especially when you hire out of pity." He had no idea that the help he was abusing was the owner of the debt he had just signed. He had no idea that the winner across the table was an employee of the loser in the corner. The ink was dry. The trap was sprung, and Richard was laughing all the way to the guillotine. Kowalski snapped the latches of his leather briefcase shut, with a sound that echoed through the silent boardroom like a gunshot. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a handshake to seal the deal. He simply placed his hand flat on the leather case, protecting the document inside as if it were a holy relic. Richard was already reaching for the bottle of champagne sitting in the ice bucket, his face flushed with the premature victory of a man who thinks he has gotten away with murder. He was practically vibrating with greed, ready to toast his own brilliance, ready to celebrate the money that would fuel his vices for another year. But Kowalski remained seated. He looked at Richard with a strange, unreadable expression, something between pity and amusement. "Hold the champagne, Richard," he said, his voice cutting through the celebratory mood. "As I mentioned on the phone, the transaction is not complete until the physical inspection is finished. The chairman is very particular. He does not sign checks for dirty companies. He wants to see for himself that his standards have been met." Richard rolled his eyes, letting out an exasperated sigh. "This is ridiculous," he huffed, waving a hand at the pristine conference room. "Look around you, Arthur. The place is spotless. We have people like him." He gestured dismissively at Toby in the corner, scrubbing the floors all night. "If your chairman finds a speck of dust, I will eat it myself. Where is this germaphobe anyway?" "Is he waiting in the lobby?" Kowalski stood up, slowly checking his watch. "No," he said softly. "He is not in the lobby. He is right outside." Kowalski turned toward the heavy double doors at the end of the room. He nodded once. The doors didn't just open. They swung inward with a slow, deliberate weight, as if pushed by a force of nature. For a moment, there was only a silhouette framed by the bright lights of the hallway. Then the figure stepped into the room. The air in the boardroom seemed to vanish. Richard froze, his hand still gripping the neck of the champagne bottle. Vanessa dropped her phone, the clatter loud on the hardwood floor. Toby, standing in the shadows in his blue jumpsuit, gasped, his eyes going wide with disbelief. It was me. But it wasn't the version of me they knew. The faded flannel shirt was gone. The oil-stained jeans were gone. The scuffed work boots were gone. In their place stood a man wearing a charcoal gray three-piece Italian suit that had been tailored to fit my shoulders perfectly. My white shirt was crisp and starched. My tie was silk, tied in a perfect Windsor knot. On my wrist sat a Patek Philippe watch that cost more than the entire building we were standing in. I didn't walk with the shuffle of a tired old man. I walked with the heavy, rhythmic stride of a man who owns the ground beneath his feet. I stopped at the head of the table. I didn't say a word. I just looked at them. I let them take it in. I let them try to reconcile the image of the poor, embarrassing father-in-law with the titan of industry standing before them. Richard blinked, his brain struggling to process the visual data. He squinted, leaning forward, a nervous laugh bubbling up in his throat. "Conrad," he asked, his voice shaking. "What? What are you doing here? How did you get past security, and whose suit is that? Did you rent a costume for a funeral?" I ignored him. I turned my head slowly and looked at Kowalski. "Is the contract secured?" I asked, my voice low and commanding. Kowalski stood at attention. "Yes, sir," he replied. "Signed and witnessed. Clause 47 is active." "Good," I said. I turned back to Richard. I stepped closer until I was looming over him in his chair. "I am not here for a funeral, Richard. I am here for an eviction." The heavy thud of my steel-toed work boots was gone. In its place was the sharp, authoritative click of hand-stitched alligator leather hitting the hardwood floor. Each step was a gavel strike, announcing a judgment. I walked into the light of the boardroom, and the cheap, fluorescent hum of the office seemed to die down in reverence. The flannel shirt that smelled of sawdust and old oil was a distant memory. I was wrapped in charcoal gray wool cut by a master tailor in Milan, a suit that cost more than the car Richard drove. It wasn't just clothing, it was armor. The fabric moved with me, liquid and expensive screaming power, without whispering a single word. I adjusted my cuffs. Solid gold links glinted under the lights, catching the eye of every person in the room. I saw the air leave Richard's lungs. He sat there, his mouth hanging open like a fish on a hook. He blinked rapidly, trying to reconcile the image of the hillbilly he had thrown out into the alley yesterday with the industrial titan standing before him. He looked at the silk tie knotted with mathematical precision. He looked at the Patek Philippe watch on my wrist, its face complicated and timeless, ticking away the seconds of his career. He couldn't process it. His brain was misfiring. Vanessa's face went the color of old ash. She dropped her hand from that stolen Hermes bag as if it had suddenly burned her skin. She knew. Women notice details, and she noticed the cut of the lapel. She noticed the way I held myself. She realized in a heartbeat that the bank account she had drained was just pocket change to the man standing here. She looked from me to the bag and back to me, and I saw the terror bloom in her eyes. She realized she hadn't scammed a helpless old man. She had stolen from a king. And Toby, my boy. He pressed himself against the wall in his oversized blue jumpsuit, his eyes wide as saucers. He looked at me like he was seeing a stranger, but then he saw my eyes. The same eyes that had watched him play baseball. The same eyes that had looked at him with pride when he graduated. He didn't say a word. He just stared, paralyzed by the transformation. I didn't stop at the door. I walked straight to the head of the table. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't wait to be invited. I walked with the heavy, rhythmic stride of a man who owns the ground beneath his feet. I walked past the board members who shrank back in their chairs, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure. I walked past Kowalski, who stood up and buttoned his jacket in a sign of absolute respect. I stood behind the empty chair at the opposite end of the table facing Richard. I placed my manicured hands on the mahogany. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. When you own the building, you don't need to raise your voice. I looked at Richard not with anger, but with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist looking at a bug under a microscope. The silence in the room was suffocating. It was the heavy electric silence of a storm about to break. I let him look at the suit. I let him look at the shoes. I let him realize that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Richard looked like his brain had just short-circuited. He stood there with his mouth opening and closing, like a fish on a dock, unable to process the visual data in front of him. He looked at my face, weathered and lined from years of honest work, and tried to reconcile it with the charcoal Italian wool and the silk tie. He looked at Kowalski, who was standing respectfully at my side, and then back at me. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful to watch. He couldn't accept that the man he had thrown out of the building yesterday was now standing in his boardroom, looking like he owned the city. "You Rachel," finally sputtered, his voice cracking with a mix of confusion and indignation. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest. You are the old man. The hillbilly. The security guard from the alley. What the hell is this? Is this a joke?" He looked around the room at his board members, desperate for someone to validate his reality. "Who let him in?" he screamed, his face turning a blotchy red. "Security. Someone call security immediately. This man is trespassing. He is deranged. He probably stole that suit from a dry cleaner." I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply stood there, letting his panic wash over me like a harmless wave against a cliff face. I slowly raised my hand and adjusted the gold cufflink on my left wrist. The movement was small, precise, and infinitely calm. It was a gesture of total control. "Sit down, Richard," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had a resonance that filled the room, a deep rumbling baritone that vibrated in the chest. It was the voice I used when I was telling a foreman that a structural beam was failing. It was not a request. Richard froze. The authority in my tone stopped him cold. He blinked, looking at me with a new kind of fear. "I am not a security guard." I continued, taking a slow step toward the table. "And I am not a trespasser. You invited me here. In fact, you begged for this meeting." I gestured to Kowalski, who nodded. "You wanted to meet the chairman of Blackwood Holdings. You wanted to meet the man who was going to save your miserable company with a $5 million check. Well, look closely, Richard. You are looking at him." Richard's knees seemed to give out. He slumped back into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That is impossible. You are Conrad. You are a retired construction worker. You live in a shack." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the cold, sharp smile of a wolf. "I am a retired builder, yes. I built half the skyline you are looking at out that window. But I didn't spend all my money on gambling and mistresses, Richard. I saved it. I invested it. And now I use it to clean up messes." I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with my son in the corner. Toby was staring at me, his jaw slack, the water pitcher tilting dangerously in his hand. "I came here for the inspection you insisted on," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "I came to see if the facilities met my standards. I came to see if your most valuable employee, my son, has managed to clean up the filth in this building. But I am not talking about the floors, Richard. I am talking about you. You are the stain, and I am here to wipe you out." I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a thick stack of papers bound with a rubber band. They were old documents, crinkled at the edges, smelling of the basement archive where they had been stored. I didn't hand them to Richard politely. I threw them. They hit the polished mahogany table with a heavy, flat smack that sounded like a judge's gavel coming down for a death sentence. The papers slid across the wood, fanning out in front of him, a messy display of his own incompetence. "Look at them, Richard," I commanded, my voice echoing off the walls. "Do you recognize those? Those are the bearer bonds you issued 5 years ago. The high-risk, high-yield junk bonds you floated to cover up your gambling losses in Macau. You thought you were selling them to anonymous investors on the Asian market. You thought you were hiding your debt in a labyrinth of shell companies where no one would ever find it." I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the table, leaning my weight into them, until my face was inches from his sweating forehead. "You were wrong. You weren't selling them to strangers. You were selling them to me. Every single time you needed a bailout, every time you needed quick cash to pay off a bookie or buy a Silence, Blackwood Holdings was there to buy the debt. I bought it all, Richard. I bought the notes. I bought the liens. I bought the mortgages. I pointed a finger at the scattered papers. You don't just owe the bank money. You owe me. You owe my fund $12 million. I am your primary creditor. I am the only creditor that matters. And for the last 5 years, I have been letting you dig your hole deeper and deeper, just waiting for the moment you tried to bury my son in it. Richard stared at the papers, his face draining of all color, until he looked like a wax figure melting under the heat. He reached out a shaking hand to touch a bond certificate, as if hoping it was a hallucination. $12 million, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You own it all. Everything, I said, straightening up and picking up the blue contract he had just signed. And thanks to this little piece of paper, I don't just own the debt anymore. I own the collateral. I held the contract up, turning it so the light caught his arrogant, sprawling signature. You didn't read Clause 47, did you? The instant default clause. It states that if the borrower is found to be financially insolvent or morally compromised, the lender has the right to seize all assets immediately. No court dates, no arbitration, immediate transfer of ownership. I dropped the contract onto the pile of bonds. It is over, Richard. As of the moment you put ink to that paper, Pendergast Logistics ceased to exist. You are no longer the CEO. You are no longer the owner. You are trespassing on private property. This building is mine. The trucks are mine. The chair you are sitting in is mine. Even the stapler on your desk belongs to me now. You wanted to give my son a job. Well, I am giving you one. You are fired. Get out of my chair. Richard was a broken man, slumped in a chair that no longer belonged to him. But I wasn't finished. I turned my body, slowly pivoting on my heel to face the woman sitting to his right. Vanessa had gone very still. Her face was pale, her makeup standing out like a mask on a mannequin. She was clutching that black Hermes bag so tightly her knuckles were white, as if she could physically squeeze the guilt out of it. She met my eyes for a second, then looked away, unable to bear the weight of the judgment coming her way. I reached into my inner pocket one last time. I didn't pull out a contract. I pulled out a black envelope. I opened it and spilled the contents onto the polished mahogany table. Photographs. Dozens of them. They slid across the wood, a glossy cascade of betrayal. They stopped right in front of her. Vanessa entering the St. Regis Hotel. Vanessa kissing Marcus Sterling in the elevator. Vanessa drinking wine at a bistro on Tuesday afternoon. The silence in the room changed texture. It went from the silence of financial ruin to the silence of personal devastation. I watched her eyes dart across the images. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. The timestamps were irrefutable. While my son was on his knees scrubbing your father's filth, I said, my voice low and cutting, you were busy auditing the CFO. You weren't organizing charity galas. You were organizing your exit strategy. I picked up a piece of paper from the pile. It was the transaction log from this morning. And this I said, holding it up so the board members could see. 7:22 a.m. You called me weeping. You said Toby was going to jail. You said you needed $10,000 to save him. I pointed a finger at the bag on her arm. You stole my retirement savings to buy a purse, Vanessa. That isn't just a lie. That is grand larceny. You sold your husband's safety for a piece of leather. Toby made a sound in the corner, a strangled gasp of pain. But I wasn't done. I had to cut the last chain. The strongest one. I pulled out a single folded sheet of medical paper. This, I said, my voice turning to ice, is a lab report from a private clinic. You were careless with your hairbrush, Vanessa. My team recovered a sample yesterday. We ran a full hormone panel. I walked over to her and slammed the paper down on top of the photos of her lover. Negative, I announced the word ringing like a bell. Beta HCG levels are 0. Estrogen levels are normal. There is no baby Vanessa. There never was. I looked over at Toby. He was sliding down the wall, his hand over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. She lied to you, son. She invented a child because she knew you were about to leave. She knew the only thing that would keep you in this hell was your honor. She used your desire to be a father as a leash to choke you with. It was never about love. It was about control. She is not a mother. She is a monster. The silence that followed my revelation about the fake pregnancy was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum before the air rushes back in to destroy everything. Vanessa sat frozen, her mouth open in a silent scream of denial, staring at the medical report that proved she was a liar. Richard was slumped in his chair, a pile of useless bonds in front of him, looking like a man who had just watched his house burn down. But the silence didn't last. It was broken by the sound of heavy boots in the hallway. Not the polite tapping of dress shoes, but the rhythmic, authoritative thud of a tactical team. The double doors swung open again. This time it wasn't a billionaire entering. It was the Economic Crimes Unit. I had called them an hour ago. I had given Kowalski the signal the moment Richard signed the contract, the moment the fraud was officially consummated. 4 officers in dark uniforms marched into the room, their faces grim and professional. They didn't look at the expensive art on the walls. They walked straight to the head of the table. Richard Pendergast, the lead detective, announced, his voice flat and bored as if he did this every Tuesday. You are under arrest for securities fraud, grand larceny, and 42 counts of forgery. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back. Richard scrambled up, knocking his chair over with a loud crash. No, he shrieked, his voice cracking. This is a mistake. You can't touch me. I am a pillar of this community. I have friends in the mayor's office. Look at him, he pointed a shaking finger at me. He set me up. That man is the criminal. The detective didn't argue. He simply grabbed Richard's wrist, twisted it behind his back with practiced ease, and slapped the handcuffs on. The metallic click of the ratchet locking into place was the loudest sound in the world. It was the sound of an empire ending. Richard began to sob, a pathetic, wet sound, begging the board members to help him, but they all looked away, terrified of being dragged down with him. They watched as the CEO was frog-marched out of his own boardroom, his expensive suit rumpled, his dignity gone. Vanessa watched her father disappear into the hallway. She looked at the empty doorway, then at the police officers, who were now turning their attention to the rest of the room, and then at me. She saw the ice in my eyes. She realized the money was gone. She realized and her lover Marcus Sterling was likely being arrested in his office downstairs at this very moment. She had no allies left. She had no leverage. Panic, raw and animalistic, took over. She didn't run for the door. She ran to the corner of the room. She ran to the man in the blue jumpsuit. Vanessa threw herself at Toby's feet. She fell to her knees on the hard floor, heedless of her white dress, and wrapped her arms around his legs. She buried her face in the cheap, chemical-smelling fabric of his uniform and began to wail. "Toby, baby, please," she cried, looking up at him with tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "You have to help me. You have to tell them I didn't know. I am a victim here, Toby. Daddy forced me. He made me do it. He said he would kill me if I didn't go along with the plan. I was so scared." She grabbed his hand, her grip desperate and claw-like. "I love you, Toby. You know I love you. The baby thing. I wanted to tell you the truth, but I was afraid you would leave me. We can fix this. Just tell your dad to call them off. We can go away. Just you and me. I will be a good wife, I promise. Please, honey, don't let them take me." Toby looked down at her. He looked at the woman who had mocked him 5 minutes ago. He looked at the woman who had spent his father's life savings on a purse while threatening him with jail. He stood there trembling, as the woman who had broken him now begged him to put her back together. Toby looked down at the woman clawing at his ankles. A minute ago she had been a queen sneering at him from her high tower. Now she was just a desperate creature in a ruined dress, begging the man she had dehumanized to save her from the consequences of her own greed. The sobbing, the pleading, the frantic grasp of her manicured fingers on his cheap polyester pant leg, it all felt distant. It was like watching a bad actress perform a scene in a language he no longer understood. He slowly lifted his eyes. He looked across the room at the man standing at the head of the table. His father. Conrad stood there in his charcoal suit, a titan of industry, unmovable and terrifying to everyone else in the room. But Toby didn't see the billionaire. He saw the man who had packed his lunchbox every day for 20 years. He saw the man who had driven a rusted truck so his son could drive a sedan. He saw the man who had humiliated himself, allowed himself to be thrown into the street like garbage just to gather the evidence needed to set his son free. The shame that had been crushing Toby for months, the heavy, suffocating weight of his own perceived failure, began to evaporate. It wasn't his failure. It was their cruelty. Toby looked back down at Vanessa. He didn't feel love. He didn't feel hate. He felt a sudden, profound emptiness, like a fever breaking after a long illness. He reached down not to help her up, but to peel her fingers off his leg. He did it gently, firmly, the way one might remove a burr from clothing. He stepped back, putting distance between his work boots and her kneeling form. He raised his left hand. The gold band on his ring finger glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was a simple band, one he had bought with his own savings, believing it symbolized a partnership. He twisted it. It was tight, stuck on skin that was swollen from hours of manual labor and exposure to harsh chemicals. He pulled harder, ignoring the friction burn. Vanessa stopped crying for a second, watching him, her eyes widening as she realized what he was doing. "Toby, no," she whispered. "Don't." With a final sharp tug, the ring slid off. Toby held it between his thumb and forefinger. It felt light, insignificant. A small circle of metal that had been a shackle for 3 years. He turned toward the plastic bucket sitting in the corner. The gray, murky water inside smelled of bleach and the grime of the office floor. It was the tool of his humiliation, the symbol of his servitude. He walked over to it. He held his hand over the water. He didn't throw the ring. He simply opened his fingers. There was a small, wet plop as the gold hit the water. It sank instantly, disappearing into the sludge at the bottom, gone forever amidst the dirt he had been forced to clean. He turned back to face her. His voice when he spoke was steady. It was the voice of a Blackwood. "You were right, Vanessa," he said, the words cutting through the silence like a razor. "You told me I was nothing but a janitor. You told me I was only good for cleaning up messes." He looked at the police officers leading Richard away, then at the empty spot where his marriage used to be. "Well, I guess I finally learned how to do my job," he said, wiping his hands on his jumpsuit, as if washing her off his skin. "Because I just cleaned up the biggest piece of trash in my life." He didn't wait for her response. He didn't look back. He walked toward his father, leaving the bucket, the ring, and the woman in the dust of the past. 6 months is a long time in the business world, but for Richard Pendergast it must feel like an eternity. He traded his Italian silk suits for a state-issued orange jumpsuit that fits him about as well as his old ego did. They say he spends his time in the minimum security library trying to give financial advice to fellow inmates who pay him in packets of instant noodles. He is still trying to be the big man even inside a concrete box. He will be there for 8 years. He has plenty of time to think about the fine print he ignored and the people he stepped on. The empire he built on fraud has been dissolved, sold off for parts to pay back the creditors he cheated. Vanessa found a new stage for her performances, but the audience is much less forgiving. She works the breakfast shift at a diner on the south side of the city, the kind of place where the menu is laminated and sticky. She wears a polyester uniform that smells of fry oil and cheap coffee. I heard she had to sell the Hermes bag to pay her first month's rent in a studio apartment. Every day she has to smile at rude customers and clean up their messes. Every time she wipes a table, I wonder if she remembers the way she looked at Toby when he was on his knees. Life has a brutal way of balancing the ledger. She wanted to marry into money, but she ended up married to hard labor. But the best investment I ever made was not buying the company. It was how I handled the asset that mattered most. I did not give Toby the keys to the kingdom. I did not hand him a check for millions and tell him to retire. That would have ruined him just as surely as Richard's abuse did. A man needs purpose, not just charity. I gave him a job, a real one. Toby manages the East Side distribution hub now. He is in charge of 40 men and a fleet of trucks. He does not sit in a glass tower. He has a small office with a metal desk, but he spends most of his time on the floor. He wears a safety vest and steel-toed boots. When he speaks, his crew listens not because they are afraid of him, but because they respect him. He knows every job in that warehouse because he has done the hardest one of all. He walks with his head up. He laughs with his team. He is rebuilding his credit and his confidence one paycheck at a time. I pulled my old Ford truck into the warehouse lot at noon. I had put the Rolls-Royce back in storage under a tarp. That car was a weapon of war, and the war was over. I was just a father again. Toby walked out to meet me, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, a genuine smile on his face that reached his eyes. We dropped the rusty tailgate and sat there side by side, legs dangling over the edge. We ate ham sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and drank coffee from a thermos. The sun was warm on our faces, and the air smelled of diesel and dust, a smell we both loved. We did not talk about Richard. We did not talk about Vanessa or the millions of dollars in the trust fund. We talked about the shipment coming in from Ohio. We talked about the baseball game on the radio. I looked at my son, free from the debt, free from the lies, and finally comfortable in his own skin. It cost me $12 million to get to this lunch, but looking at the peace in his eyes, I knew I got it at a bargain. We were just two men eating lunch on a tailgate, and for the first time in a long time, everything was exactly as it should be. This story reminds us that true power is not defined by the price of your suit or the title on your door, but by the integrity of your character. Richard and Vanessa were so blinded by greed and status that they forgot the most basic rule of life: treat everyone with respect, because you never know who is actually holding the keys. Wealth without wisdom is just a recipe for ruin, while dignity and hard work are the only currencies that never lose their value. The most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting commands. It is the one who quietly observes, waits, and strikes when the time is right. If you felt the satisfaction of justice in this story, please like and follow for more, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who you really were?